Welcome, night seekers, to Netheric Horror. Tonight, true scary stories, gentle narration, and soothing rain await. Relax, close your eyes, embrace the darkness, and let your nightmare journey begin forever together. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Sweet dreams, if you can. Growing up, my family moved around quite a bit, though we always stayed within the same town, never straying too far from the same familiar streets and neighborhoods we had always known. When I was about 10 years old, we ended up moving into a house that was bigger than anything we had lived in before, somewhat older than our previous places, though not old enough to be considered ancient or falling apart in any way. We were renting it at the time, since my parents had just gone through a divorce, and the family living there now consisted of myself, my mother, my younger brother, and my new stepfather. All of us settling into this unfamiliar but spacious new home together as we tried to figure out what our new version of normal looked like. Looking back on it now, even with everything that happened while we lived there, I can honestly say that I loved that house. There was something about it that felt comfortable, even homey, despite everything strange that went on beneath the surface of our day-to-day life there. But there was also, without question, some genuinely creepy stuff that happened during the years we spent in that place. Things that still linger uncomfortably in my memory, even now, long after we moved away. The basement of that house was this huge open area, far bigger than anything I had ever had access to in a previous home, and we ended up converting it into something of a games room, filling it with whatever furniture and entertainment we could fit down there. I spent an enormous amount of time in that basement as a kid, playing games, hanging out, doing whatever it is that 10, 11, 12-year-olds do to fill their afternoons and evenings. But looking back now, with the benefit of adult hindsight, there was something about the architecture of that basement that has always given me an uneasy feeling whenever I think about it. It was too perfect somehow, too symmetrical, too plain in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if the space had been designed with some very specific and deliberate purpose in mind, rather than simply being an ordinary basement built for ordinary family use. Leading off from that basement, there was a corner of the space that had two separate doors built into it. One of these doors led into an old bathroom, a space that the owner of the house had, for whatever reason, decided to keep permanently locked. In the entire 3 years that we lived in that house, I never once saw the inside of that bathroom. It remained locked the whole time, a small, unexplained mystery tucked into the corner of a space I otherwise knew intimately, having spent so many hours down there over the years. The second door in that same corner led into an even stranger part of the house, a narrow, cramped hallway that also happened to double as the furnace room, filled with the pipes and machinery that kept the house heated through the long, brutal winters we get in that part of the world. At the end of this narrow hallway was one final door, just as tight and narrow as the hallway leading to it, and just like the bathroom door, this one too had been locked by the owner's explicit choice, left permanently sealed off from the rest of the house for the entire time we lived there. My mother told me once that she had actually seen inside that particular room, back when she first met the owner of the house before we moved in. According to her, the room was even larger than our sprawling basement games room, and it was absolutely packed full of old, strange belongings. The kind of accumulated clutter that builds up in a space nobody uses anymore, but nobody wants to fully clear out either. She never went into much more detail than that about what exactly filled that room, but even that vague description was enough to make the locked door at the end of that narrow hallway feel like it was hiding something far more significant than simple storage. Within the first few months of living in that house, we started having serious, persistent problems with the security system and the smoke detector. The owners of the house, who lived far to the north, and were apparently fairly wealthy, had installed this elaborate whole house alarm system. The kind of setup you would not necessarily expect in an ordinary rental property. Every single time a door leading to the outside was opened, a distinct two-tone alarm would sound throughout the house, almost identical to the chime you hear when walking into a retail store, alerting employees that a customer has entered. The system also had small speakers built into every single room of the house, which doubled as a kind of intercom and microphone setup, meaning that no matter where you happened to be in that house, you could clearly hear the door alarm, or the smoke detector alarm, ringing out from any room at all. For those first few months, the smoke detector portion of that system in particular gave us constant, maddening trouble. It would go off completely at random, sometimes blaring for long, uninterrupted stretches of time before simply falling silent again on its own, with no clear pattern or trigger that any of us could identify. It was endlessly frustrating, especially since none of us were particularly familiar with how the system actually worked or how to properly reset it, so for a while we mostly just tolerated it, assuming it was some kind of ordinary technical glitch that would eventually sort itself out. Eventually, after enough repeated incidents, we got fed up enough to actually call the security company that managed the system, hoping they could explain what was going wrong and help us put a stop to it. The support representative we spoke with pulled up our account on his computer, and after a moment, responded with a strange kind of hesitation in his voice, clearly confused by what he was seeing on his end. According to his records, our alarm system was completely disconnected and should have been entirely inactive, incapable of producing any alarms or alerts whatsoever. And yet there we were, listening to it blare loudly through our house at that very moment, very much active, despite what his computer screen was telling him should have been impossible. One particular evening has always stood out to me above all the others from that time. I was home alone that night, which in itself was not unusual, but I remember the specific circumstances clearly because of what happened. It was the dead of winter in the middle of Alberta, the kind of bitter, dark winter evening where the sun disappears early and the cold outside feels almost oppressive, even from inside a warm house. I was upstairs in this small loft space positioned directly above the front door, sitting at the computer, doing whatever it is a kid that age does to pass the time on a quiet evening alone. I do not remember exactly where the rest of my family was that particular night, but at some point while I was sitting up there, I heard the door alarm let out its familiar two-tone beep, indicating that somewhere in the house a door leading outside had just been opened. The intercom speaker was positioned right there at the desk where I was sitting, so I heard it clearly and immediately. But the actual door in question sounded far too distant to be the front door, which was located directly below the loft I was sitting in. It had to have been either the side door or the door connecting to the garage, both of which were situated about 20 feet down a hallway from the front door beneath me. I heard the door close again a moment later. It could not have been the garage, I reasoned, because I had not heard the telltale sound of the large garage door opening, which was distinct and unmistakable whenever it happened. So it had to have been the side door instead. Then I heard footsteps coming down the hallway beneath me, moving at a fairly brisk pace. I could tell, just from the sound of them, that whoever was walking was wearing heavy boots, the kind that make a distinct, solid thumping sound against the floor. Without thinking too much about it, I assumed it must be my stepdad, home early from work for whatever reason, and I did not feel any particular alarm at the sound, simply continuing on with whatever I had been doing at the computer. I honestly cannot remember now whether those footsteps suddenly stopped abruptly, or whether I simply lost track of them because my attention had drifted elsewhere, back to the computer screen or whatever I had been focused on. But what I do remember, with absolute certainty, is that I never heard that door alarm sound again for the rest of that evening, and when I eventually went downstairs myself a few minutes later, there was no one else anywhere in that house. Just me, alone, exactly as I had been before I heard that door open and those boots come walking down the hallway beneath me. I want to be fair and acknowledge that this particular incident is probably explainable in some ordinary way, some ordinary sound within the house that I simply misattributed in the moment, especially given how prone that whole alarm system was to malfunctioning throughout our time there. But it is a memory that has always sat uneasily with me regardless. One of those small, unresolved details that never quite fades away completely, no matter how many rational explanations you try to layer over it. We ended up moving out of that house when I was around 13 years old, relocating to a different home elsewhere in town. I remember distinctly on our very first night in that brand new house, waking up in the middle of the night. I am almost completely certain that I was genuinely awake in that moment, not caught in some half-dreaming state, and as I lay there, I heard that same unmistakable alarm sound again. The exact same two-tone chime from the old house's security system, somehow present in a completely different home that had never had anything like that system installed in the first place. I was just about to get out of bed myself and go investigate, or attempt to silence whatever was making that sound, when I heard one of my parents get up instead, muttering quietly to themselves as they moved around, apparently fiddling with something in an attempt to make the noise stop. Reassured that someone else was already handling it, I settled back down and drifted off to sleep without giving it much further thought. The next morning, I mentioned casually to my mother that she must have had to get up in the middle of the night to deal with some kind of alarm going off in our new house. She looked back at me with genuine confusion on her face and told me that no alarm had gone off at all that night, that she had slept soundly straight through until morning without getting up for anything. It was only a year or two ago, as an adult, long after I had grown up and moved out on my own, that I finally learned something about that original rental house that put the entire experience into a completely different, far more unsettling light. My mother told me that the house we had rented all those years ago, the one with the persistent alarm problems and the two mysteriously locked doors down in the basement, was actually a house she had known about back when she herself was still in high school, long before any of us had ever moved in there. Apparently, there had been a house fire in that very building at some point in the past, a fire in which a young boy had died. I am genuinely tearing up a little bit even now as I think about this part of the story, because it still creeps me out in a way that is hard to fully put into words. His name, my mother told me, was Andy. He had died of smoke inhalation during that fire, and the room where it happened, the room where he had ultimately lost his life, was the very same room at the end of that narrow basement hallway, the room that had remained locked the entire 3 years we lived in that house. The same room my mother had once glimpsed years earlier and described as being full of old, strange belongings that no one ever seemed to touch. When I was 18 years old, I left my home state of Kentucky to start college out in Kansas. A move that felt like a huge step at the time, the kind of transition that marks the real beginning of adulthood for a lot of people. When I first went out there in July or August to get settled before the semester began, my parents drove me and all of my belongings out to campus themselves, helped me get everything unpacked and set up in my new dorm room, and then said their goodbyes and drove back home, leaving me there on my own for the first time in my life. I did not have a car with me on campus for those first couple of months, relying instead on walking, campus shuttles, and the kindness of other students with vehicles whenever I needed to get somewhere off campus. When Thanksgiving break finally rolled around, I flew back home to Kentucky to spend the holiday with my family. the first time I had seen them since they had dropped me off months earlier. After the holiday was over, instead of flying back to Kansas the way I had come, I decided to drive my own car back out to school instead, which meant I finally had a vehicle with me on campus for the rest of the school year. That drive was a long one, roughly 8.5 hours in total, taking me straight across the country along Interstate 64 and then on to Interstate 70, a long, mostly straight shot through a whole lot of open highway and small towns. Somewhere along that drive, later at night, well into the darker, quieter hours, when most normal travelers are either already at their destination or fast asleep somewhere along the way, I decided to stop and get some food. I pulled off at a Denny's I spotted just off the highway, the kind of familiar, reliable roadside diner that exists in some form at nearly every major highway exit in the country, open late, lit up bright against the surrounding darkness. A small island of light and activity in an otherwise quiet stretch of road. After eating, I realized my gas tank was running low, so I decided to fill up before continuing on with the rest of my drive. Directly across the road from the Denny's, I noticed an old gas station, the kind of place that immediately gives off a sense of having been there for decades, worn down by years of use and weather, but still very much open and operating. I pulled in and parked next to one of the pumps, and I remember noticing right away just how old and outdated the pumps themselves looked. Nothing like the sleek, modern digital pumps you see at most gas stations today. These were old, mechanical-looking things, with dials and analog displays rather than digital screens. The kind of equipment that felt like it belonged to a much earlier era. There was an old man working at the station that night, and to my surprise, he actually came out to my car himself, walking over to the full service lane where I had parked, and proceeded to fill up my tank for me personally, the way gas station attendants used to do decades ago before self-service pumps became the standard everywhere. It felt like a small, pleasant throwback to an older time, the kind of personal service you simply do not encounter much anymore at most modern gas stations. When the tank was full, I reached out and handed him my credit card to pay. But he told me that I would need to come inside the station itself to process the payment, since apparently whatever system he used for card transactions was not something he could handle right there at the pump. I did not think much of this at all. It seemed like a reasonable enough quirk for an older, more old-fashioned establishment, so I followed him inside, and while I was in there, I grabbed a soda for the rest of my drive as well, something to keep me a little more alert as I continued on through the night. Inside, he ran my credit card through one of those old-fashioned card imprint machines, the kind where you slide a small mechanical arm back and forth across the card to physically press the raised numbers onto a paper receipt, creating a carbon copy that both the customer and the business keep for their own records. It was the kind of equipment that had mostly disappeared from everyday use by the time I was 18, replaced everywhere else by electronic card readers and instant digital transactions, but I did not find it especially strange at the time. Just another small detail of what already felt like a slightly old-fashioned, out-of-the-way establishment. He handed me the carbon copy of the receipt to sign. I signed it, and then I got back in my car and continued on toward Kansas, thinking nothing more of the whole encounter. A little while later, checking my credit card statement online, I noticed that the $20 or so I had spent on gas that night never actually showed up as a charge. At the time, I did not think too much of it. I simply assumed that because the station used such old, outdated equipment, maybe the charge just took longer to process than usual, perhaps getting batched together with other transactions and processed all at once at the end of the month rather than immediately, the way older, less automated systems sometimes worked. It was only $20 after all, not enough money to seriously bother chasing down or worrying about, so I let it go without a second thought. A few weeks later, when Christmas break arrived, I decided to make the same long drive back home to Kentucky again, and this time I invited one of my roommates to come along with me, since his own family happened to be out of the country for the holidays, and he did not have anywhere else in particular to spend the break. We set out together, making the same long trip across those same familiar highways, retracing more or less the same route I had taken back in November. At some point during the drive, my roommate mentioned that he was getting hungry, and I told him, with the easy confidence of someone who had made this exact drive before and remembered the route fairly well, that I knew there was a Denny's just up the road a little further, a place I had stopped at myself just a month earlier. We pulled off at what I was completely certain was the exact same exit, the same Denny's. Everything looking just as familiar as I remembered it from before. It was around 5 in the evening this time, still daylight, unlike my previous late-night stop back in November. As we pulled in and parked, I happened to glance across the road toward where the old gas station had been, the same one where the elderly attendant had filled up my tank and run my card through that old carbon copy machine just weeks earlier. The station was boarded up, completely abandoned, the windows covered over, weeds pushing up visibly through cracks in the pavement of what used to be the lot where I had parked to get gas. It looked unmistakably like a place that had been closed and left to sit empty for a considerable length of time. Not the kind of abandonment that happens overnight, but the slow, gradual decay that comes from years of neglect. Confused, and more than a little unsettled, I asked our waitress at the Denny's, once we were seated inside, whether she knew anything about the gas station across the street, when exactly it had closed down. She told me, without any hesitation or uncertainty in her voice, that it had been closed for somewhere between 4 and 5 years at that point. She mentioned that the owner had apparently decided to shut the place down permanently because it would have cost too much money to replace the underground fuel tanks with newer models that met updated safety regulations, and rather than pay for that expensive upgrade, he had simply closed up shop entirely instead. My roommate looked at me like I had completely lost my mind when I told him, right there at the table, that I had personally stopped at that exact gas station and filled up my car there myself, just about a month earlier, in November. He clearly thought I must be misremembering something, mixing up locations, confusing this stop with some other gas station somewhere else along the long stretch of highway we had driven that night. When I got home for the holidays and told my family the whole story, hoping maybe they would have some better explanation for what had happened, they mostly just brushed it off, suggesting that I had probably gotten off at the wrong exit back in November. That in the dark, tired from a long drive, I had simply pulled off somewhere different than I thought I had, and that the gas station I remembered stopping at was probably still open somewhere else entirely. A completely different location that I had simply confused with the one near this particular Denny's. But I have always been someone who pays close attention to details while driving, especially on long trips like that one. I remember distinctly recognizing the same Denny's both times, the same layout, the same general area, the same sense of familiarity that comes from having been somewhere before, even at night. I do not think I got off at the wrong exit. I do not think I confused 2 different gas stations in 2 completely different locations. I remember pulling into that lot, remember the old, outdated pumps, remember the elderly attendant walking out to fill my tank personally, remember going inside to pay because he told me I needed to, remember the old carbon copy machine sliding back and forth across my credit card, remember signing that thin, slightly waxy paper receipt before getting back in my car and continuing on toward Kansas. I have gone back over this memory countless times since it happened, trying to find some rational explanation that fully satisfies me. The same way my family and my roommate both tried to offer their own reasonable, mundane explanations at the time. Maybe there really was another gas station somewhere along that stretch of highway that I am simply misremembering as being in that exact spot. Maybe exhaustion from a long, late-night drive played some kind of trick on my perception of exactly where I had stopped. These are the kinds of explanations that make logical sense. The kinds of things people say when they want to smooth over something that otherwise refuses to fit neatly into the ordinary, explainable world. But none of those explanations have ever fully managed to erase the unease I still feel whenever I think back on that night. Remembering an old man's face as he filled my tank. Remembering the particular sound and motion of that old credit card machine sliding back and forth across the raised numbers of my card. Remembering signing a physical paper receipt at a gas station that, according to every reliable, verifiable account from people who actually lived in that area, had already been closed and abandoned for 4 or 5 years by the time I supposedly stopped there. I still drive that same route sometimes now, years later, whenever I need to travel between Kentucky and Kansas for one reason or another. And every single time I pass that same stretch of highway, every time I see that same Denny's sign appear in the distance, I find myself glancing across the road toward where that old gas station used to stand, half expecting, in some strange, irrational corner of my mind, to see it lit up and open again. The same old pumps standing ready. The same elderly attendant waiting to come out and fill my tank the way he once did on a quiet, dark night that, according to everyone else's version of events, should never have been possible at all. Around the time I turned 14, my family moved into this old turn-of-the-century house that my parents still live in to this very day. It was a genuinely difficult period for our family. A lot of change happening all at once, and for me personally, it meant leaving behind the home of my grandparents, a place I had loved deeply, a place that felt warm and familiar and safe, and moving instead into what looked, at least to my 14-year-old eyes, like some kind of rundown, half-collapsing castle, sitting far away from all the friends I had grown up with and everything I had ever considered normal. The move itself did not happen quickly either. It took roughly a full year of what my family jokingly referred to as day trips, though in reality these trips consisted almost entirely of my parents working tirelessly on the house, trying to make it livable enough for an actual family to move into permanently. We would drive out there again and again over the course of that year, my parents disappearing into various rooms with tools and supplies, while my brother and I were left to entertain ourselves however we could, waiting for the day when this old, neglected house would finally be ready enough for us to call it home. I hated that place at first. I want to be completely honest about that. To a 14-year-old who had just been uprooted from everything familiar, this old house felt less like an exciting new beginning and more like a punishment. An ugly, decaying pile of wood and stone sitting far away from everyone and everything I cared about. It is strange to say now, after everything, that I actually love that house today, that it has become one of the most meaningful places in my entire life. But back then, during those long, exhausting months of renovation trips, all I felt was resentment and homesickness, missing my old life more than I can properly put into words. Over the years that followed, once we had actually moved in and settled into our new life there, a lot of strange, unexplainable things happened in and around that house. We eventually got some dogs, and more than once, they would wake the whole family up in the middle of the night, barking furiously at some completely empty corner of a room. Nothing visible there at all. At least not to any of us standing there trying to figure out what on earth had set them off so suddenly. My younger brother, to this day, insists that he once saw an actual ghost in that house, a claim he has never backed down from despite growing into an 18-year-old who now proudly identifies as an atheist. Someone who does not believe in an afterlife or spirits or anything supernatural at all, except apparently for this one specific memory that he refuses to let go of or explain away, even now. There were other strange occurrences, too, over the years, odd noises that none of us could ever trace back to any logical source. Strange, uneasy feelings that would settle over certain rooms of the house for no clear reason. Classmates of mine, once they found out where I lived, would sometimes tell me that the house had a reputation around town for being haunted. Apparently because it had sat abandoned and empty for so many years before my family ever purchased it, and there were stories going around that lights inside the house used to turn on and off on their own during all those years it stood empty, with no one living there to explain it. Honestly, looking back on most of this now, as an adult, I genuinely believe a lot of what felt so unsettling back then was probably just the ordinary anxiety and overactive imagination that comes along with being a teenager going through puberty in a big, unfamiliar, creaky old house. I do not consider myself someone who believes in ghosts. Not really. And over the years I have even gone out of my way, somewhat jokingly, to actively search for some kind of proof of paranormal activity in that house, poking around in dark corners, half hoping and half expecting to find nothing at all, which is exactly what has always happened. But there is one specific memory, one particular afternoon, that has always stood out to me as the single creepiest thing that has ever happened to me personally. Something I still cannot fully explain away, no matter how many rational theories I try to apply to it. It happened on one of those early days during the long stretch of renovation trips, back before we had officially moved into the house full-time, back when my parents were still out there working tirelessly to make the place livable, while my brother and I were largely left to entertain ourselves, trying not to get too bored while the grown-ups busied themselves with hammers and paint and whatever else needed fixing that particular day. I was sitting on this small porch attached to the house, a porch that, even now, all these years later, my family barely ever uses for anything. It is a modest little space, maybe 15 feet square, raised about 4 feet off the ground, positioned directly outside the kitchen. It overlooks a highway in the distance, though honestly the view from this particular porch has never been especially impressive or worth lingering over, especially considering there is another, much nicer porch attached to the house, complete with its own roof and a considerably better view, situated only about 20 feet away from this smaller one. It has always struck me as a strange little architectural choice, building two separate porches so close together, one clearly superior to the other in almost every practical way, but that is simply how the house was built long before we ever arrived. On this particular day, I was sitting out on that smaller, less impressive porch, either reading a book or, just as likely given how much time I spent doing this that year, sitting there with a beep gun, watching for starlings to shoot at, since the property had something of an ongoing pest problem with these invasive birds that had originally been introduced to North America from Europe and had since multiplied into enormous, unwelcome flocks. My younger brother, who would have been around 7 years old at the time, was off doing his own thing nearby, picking wild blueberries from some bushes growing about 15 feet away from where I was sitting. It was an entirely ordinary afternoon up until that point. The kind of quiet, unremarkable day that blends easily into every other similar day from that same stretch of time. Nothing about it standing out as unusual in any way. And then, completely out of nowhere, with no warning at all, I heard a voice. It was perfectly clear, perfectly distinct, not muffled or distant or the kind of half-heard sound that your brain might reasonably mistake for something else entirely. It was a voice, speaking directly, clearly asking, "Hey, you? Can you see me?" Hey? And then nothing. Silence, No further words, no explanation, no follow-up sound of any kind. Just those few words, spoken with a strange, searching quality, as if whoever or whatever had spoken them was genuinely trying to determine whether I, sitting there on that porch, was capable of perceiving them at all. I remember sitting there for a moment afterward, completely still, trying to process what I had just heard, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Had it come from somewhere further off? Some person walking along the nearby highway, their voice somehow carrying unusually far and clear across the distance? Had it been my brother, playing some kind of prank on me from where he stood picking blueberries? Had I simply imagined the whole thing, my mind playing some kind of trick on me during an otherwise uneventful, quiet afternoon? I immediately turned toward my brother and asked him directly whether he had heard anything just now, half expecting him to look at me with confusion, to tell me he had no idea what I was talking about, which would have at least given me some reassurance that I had simply imagined the whole strange incident myself. Instead, he told me that, yes, he had heard it too. He confirmed it without any hesitation, without any of the uncertainty you might expect from someone trying to figure out whether they had actually heard something or merely imagined it. He had heard the exact same thing I had, the same clear, searching voice asking if we could see whoever or whatever was speaking. And then, almost immediately after confirming this, he simply went right back to picking his blueberries, seemingly unbothered, moving on from the moment with the kind of easy, uncomplicated resilience that young children often have. The ability to register something strange and then move past it without dwelling on the implications the way an older person almost certainly would have. I, on the other hand, could not shake the strangeness of it nearly as easily. I sat there on that porch for a long while afterward, turning the whole incident over in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no one visible anywhere nearby. No person walking along that distant highway close enough to have spoken those words so clearly, no logical source I could point to and say, ah, that explains it. It was simply a voice, appearing out of nowhere, asking if it could be seen, and then disappearing just as suddenly and completely as it had arrived, leaving no further trace or explanation behind it at all. I think about that moment sometimes, even now, years later, especially whenever I hear people talk about strange stories involving figures appearing briefly and then vanishing entirely. Tales of things slipping momentarily between different planes of existence or dimensions before disappearing again just as quickly as they came. I do not know if that is what happened to my brother and me that day on that little, rarely used porch. I do not particularly believe in that kind of explanation, not in any serious, committed way. But I also cannot deny what actually happened. The clear, distinct voice both my brother and I heard at the exact same time, asking if we could see whoever was speaking, before falling completely and permanently silent. Whatever else has happened in that old house over the years, the barking dogs, my brother's persistent ghost story, the strange noises and uneasy feelings that classmates always seemed eager to attach some haunted reputation to, none of it has ever stuck with me quite as vividly or as uncomfortably as that single brief moment on that little porch, sitting there with my beep gun, listening to my brother pick blueberries 15 feet away, when a voice with no visible source asked if I could see it, and then simply stopped, leaving behind nothing but silence and a question neither of us has ever been able to properly answer. When I was a teenager, my friends and I had a sleepover one night, the kind of ordinary teenage gathering that happens constantly at that age, snacks and gossip and staying up far too late, doing whatever, felt exciting at the time. At some point during the evening, I pulled out my grandmother's old Ouija board, an object that had been sitting in our house for as long as I could remember. absolutely ancient looking, the wood worn smooth in places, and the printed letters faded from decades of handling. We decided, mostly just for fun, to break it out and mess around with it, the way teenagers often do, more interested in the thrill of pretending to summon something than in any genuine belief that anything real might happen. There were 3 of us there that night. Myself, my best friend, who I will call Amber here because her name is going to matter a great deal to the rest of the story, and a third girl who was more of a mutual acquaintance than a close friend, someone we had really only invited along because social circumstances more or less required it, the kind of situation where leaving her out would have caused more awkwardness than including her did. This third girl was known among our friend group for being especially easy to spook. Someone who took scary stories and supernatural games far more seriously than the rest of us ever did. Someone whose genuine unease always made these kinds of activities feel just a little more thrilling for everyone else involved. Amber and I, without any real malicious intent, were having a great time exaggerating the whole Ouija board experience for this girl's benefit, pretending the board was moving on its own, acting startled and unsettled ourselves in an effort to heighten the atmosphere and get a bigger reaction out of her. It was the kind of harmless, if slightly mean-spirited, teenage fun that happens at sleepovers everywhere, 2 friends teaming up to gently torment a third for the sake of a good scare. In the middle of all this playful spooking, Amber paused what she was doing and reached over to grab a small plastic baggie of candy that we had picked up earlier that day from the corner store near our neighborhood, the kind of casual snack run teenagers make before a sleepover, grabbing whatever sounded appealing at the time. Among the candy in that bag was a small, still-sealed package of those little candy conversation hearts, the ones printed with short messages and phrases on each individual heart. The kind of candy that shows up constantly around Valentine's Day, but that stores often carry throughout other parts of the year, too. At this point in the evening, it had become pretty clear to both Amber and me that our third friend was genuinely unsettled by everything we had been doing, more seriously frightened than we had really intended, and we started to feel a little guilty about how far we had pushed things just for the sake of a scare. Wanting to wrap things up and ease the tension a bit, I said something along the lines of, if there really was a spirit present with us right now, it should make its presence known to us somehow. Half joking, half trying to signal that we were ready to move on from the game and let our friend off the hook from all the manufactured spookiness. Almost immediately after I said those words, within just a few seconds, Amber's still sealed bag of candy hearts accidentally ripped open in her hands, and a small handful of the individual candies spilled out, scattering across the surface of the Ouija board sitting between us. At first, this seemed like nothing more than an ordinary, slightly clumsy accident, the kind of small mishap that happens all the time with flimsy plastic packaging. But then, one of us looked more closely at the hearts that had fallen out onto the board, and what we saw made every single one of us go completely silent. Each individual heart that had spilled out carried the same printed message, not different phrases scattered randomly the way you would expect from a bag of assorted candy hearts, which typically each carry their own unique short message like a company logo of phrases. Some hearts saying things like "be mine," or "call me," or "true love," all mixed together in one bag. Every single heart that had fallen out of that torn package that particular moment said the exact same thing. Ready, Amber? We were completely and utterly freaked out. I do not think I can properly convey just how unsettling it was to see that exact phrase, repeated identically across multiple candy hearts, spilling out onto an ancient Ouija board immediately after I had asked for some kind of sign of a spirit's presence, all while sitting directly across from a friend named, unmistakably, Amber. None of us said much of anything for a long stretch after that. We packed up the Ouija board almost immediately, and none of us ever touched it again after that night. The ancient old thing eventually getting stored away somewhere, and as far as I know, never taken back out for any purpose since. What makes this whole story even stranger, and what has kept it lodged so firmly in my memory over the years since, is what happened afterward, when we tried, almost obsessively, to explain the whole incident away as nothing more than an unlikely coincidence. We told ourselves, reasonably enough, that candy heart packaging sometimes gets filled unevenly, that maybe an entire production batch accidentally ended up loaded with duplicates of the same message due to some manufacturing error, and that we had simply happened to grab one of those defective bags purely by chance. To test this theory, we started buying more bags of the same candy hearts multiple times a week for months afterward, carefully checking every single bag we bought for any other heart bearing that exact same message, Ready Amber, specifically to try and prove to ourselves that it really had just been some kind of manufacturing fluke. Nothing more than an ordinary batch error that happened to have unusual timing. We never found another single heart with that message. Not once, across all those months of repeated purchases, all that careful checking, all those bags of candy hearts opened and sorted through in search of some kind of rational, mundane explanation. Every other bag we ever opened contained the usual, expected variety of different messages, the normal assortment you would find in any standard package of that particular candy. Only that one single bag, on that one particular night, at that one particular moment, immediately following my request for some kind of sign, had ever contained that unsettling, repeated phrase. I still have those original candy hearts saved to this day, all these years later. It has been close to 20 years now since that sleepover happened, and the small, hardened candies have not aged particularly well over that time. The printed lettering, along with whatever raised texture the message once had pressed into the surface of each heart, has worn away significantly over the decades. The paint faded and rubbed nearly smooth in places, so the message is not nearly as clear or legible as it once was on that original night. But I know what those hearts said. I remember it perfectly, and so does Amber, and so does our third friend from that night. Though I imagine she remembers it with an even greater sense of unease than either Amber or I ever have, given how thoroughly frightened she already was before that particular moment even happened. I have turned that whole night over in my mind countless times over the years since. I have tried, the same way we all tried back then with our repeated candy purchases, to find some kind of logical explanation that fully satisfies me. Something that would let me file the whole experience away as nothing more than an unusual but ultimately meaningless coincidence. Maybe it really was some strange, isolated packaging error. One single bag out of thousands produced that year somehow ending up filled entirely with duplicates of the exact same message. And we simply happened to be the unlucky. Or perhaps lucky. Depending on how you look at it, people who ended up opening that particular bag on that particular night. But even now, decades later, that explanation has never fully managed to erase the deep unease that memory still carries with it. Because it was not simply that the hearts all matched. It was the specific message itself, the fact that it directly used my best friend's actual name. A message, asking if Amber was ready, appearing at the precise moment I had jokingly asked for a sign of spiritual presence, scattering out onto an ancient Ouija board that had been sitting in a drawer in my grandmother's house for who knows how many years before that night. We never held another sleepover quite like that one again. At least not with that same old Ouija board involved. None of us ever suggested pulling it back out after that night, not even as a joke, Not even years later, when we might have looked back on the whole incident with enough distance to laugh about it. It simply became something none of us wanted to revisit, an unspoken agreement among the three of us that whatever had happened that night was best left firmly in the past. Amber and I are still close friends today, all these years later, and every so often, usually around Valentine's Day, when those little candy hearts start showing up again in stores, one of us will bring the story back up, half joking, half still genuinely unsettled by it, even after 2 decades of distance. We still have never found another heart bearing that same message, despite how many bags we bought searching for one, and we still do not have any explanation that fully satisfies either of us. Not one that manages to completely erase the memory of those scattered candies, all printed with the exact same eerie question, spilling out onto an ancient board at the exact moment we had asked for some kind of proof that something unseen was really there with us that night. This is one of those stories I absolutely love telling people whenever it comes up, partly because it still gives me goosebumps every single time I retell it, even after all these years, and partly because it is one of those experiences that I genuinely have no rational explanation for, no matter how many times I have tried to talk myself into believing there must be some simple, ordinary answer buried somewhere in the details. It happened during that particular stretch of late summer when the days are just starting to get noticeably shorter, when the sun begins setting a little earlier each evening than it did just a few weeks before, but the trees and bushes are still completely full and green, not yet touched by the earliest signs of autumn. It is a specific, in-between kind of season, warm enough during the day that you still feel like it is summer, but with evenings that remind you the season is quietly shifting underneath you. I had just finished my shift at work that night, getting off around 9:45, which was a completely normal time for me to be heading home. Nothing unusual about the hour itself. I started my walk home the same way I always did, alone, on foot, following the same familiar route I had walked dozens, if not hundreds of times before. By this point in the evening, it was fully dark outside, the sun having set a while earlier, leaving the sky a deep uniform black overhead. My route home took me along a sidewalk that climbs up a fairly long hill, one that curves first to the left and then bends back to the right, forming a long, gradual S shape as it winds its way upward. For some reason, this particular stretch of road has very few working streetlights along it, making it noticeably darker than most of the rest of my walk home, and if I am being completely honest, it has always been my least favorite section of the entire route. The part I tend to walk through a little faster than the rest, just out of some instinctive desire to get past it and back into better lit surroundings. On one side of this stretch of road, to my left, there is a wide, open soccer field, empty and dark at that hour, stretching out toward a school building sitting at the far end of it. On the other side, to my right, there is a softball field, similarly empty, surrounded along its far edge by a thick line of trees. Neither field had any lighting active at that hour, and both blended almost seamlessly into the darkness surrounding them, appearing as nothing more than solid black space on either side of the sidewalk as I made my way up the hill. As I walked, I was absent-mindedly playing with the little metal cap from a juice bottle I had finished earlier that day, the kind of cap that, if you press down on the center of it, makes a distinct clicking sound as it pops back into its original shape. It is a small, satisfying little noise, the sort of thing that is easy to fidget with without even really thinking about it. And I have always had a habit of playing with random small objects like that when I am bored or just passing time during a long walk. So there I was, walking up this dark, quiet hill, clicking this little bottle cap, absent-mindedly every so often, not really paying much conscious attention to the sound itself. Once I reached the top of the S-curve, right around the point where the path starts bending back to the right, I happened to stop clicking the cap for a moment. my attention drifting elsewhere for just a few seconds. And in that brief pause, from somewhere off to my right, out of the deep darkness surrounding that softball field, I heard something clicking back. I slowed my pace almost immediately and turned to look in that direction, but it was simply too dark to make out anything at all, just an undifferentiated wall of black stretching out toward where I knew the trees were standing at the edge of the field. I told myself, in that first instant, that I was probably just imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me the way it sometimes does when you are walking alone through an unusually dark stretch of road at night. To test this theory, almost without fully deciding to, I clicked the bottle cap a few more times myself, and then stood there quietly, listening carefully into the darkness. Sure enough, after a few seconds of silence, something clicked back again, several times in a row, echoing faintly from somewhere out there among the dark shapes of the softball field. That was more than enough for me. Whatever this was, whether it was some person deliberately messing with me from the shadows, or something else entirely that I did not want to think too hard about in that moment, I decided immediately that I was done testing it any further. I picked up my pace considerably, tossing the bottle cap away entirely, wanting nothing more to do with whatever strange game seemed to be unfolding around me in the dark. At this point in my walk, I was approaching a stretch of road that ran alongside a well-lit 3-lane highway, a welcome change from the darker section I had just come through. But the clicking sound had not stopped. If anything, it seemed to have shifted position slightly, now coming from a stand of trees on the opposite side of the street from where I was walking. Still, I told myself that this was fine, that I was about to turn off in a different direction entirely anyway, putting further distance between myself and wherever that sound was originating from. Right after making that turn, leaving the highway and the trees behind me, I found myself walking alongside a tall wooden fence on my left, tall enough that I could not see over it or past it at all, though I knew from general familiarity with the neighborhood that there were houses sitting on the other side of that fence. To my right, there was the same 3-lane highway continuing along, with more houses visible further off in that direction as well. For a moment, I genuinely believed I was in the clear, back in a well-populated, well-lit section of my usual route home, far enough now from that dark stretch by the softball field that whatever had been clicking back at me surely could not have followed. Then, from somewhere off to my right, I heard a dog barking. At first, this seemed like an entirely ordinary sound, nothing more than a neighborhood dog reacting to something in its yard the way dogs do constantly, especially at night. But the barking quickly became more agitated, sharper and more frantic sounding with each passing second, clearly reacting to something that was upsetting it. And then, without any warning at all, the barking cut off abruptly with an incredibly loud, pained yelp, the kind of sound a dog makes only when it has been badly hurt in some sudden, violent way. And then, nothing. Complete silence. I spun around toward the direction the sound had come from, genuinely horrified, desperately trying to see anything at all in the darkness that might explain what had just happened. But there was nothing visible, no movement, no sign of the dog or whatever might have caused it, that sudden, terrible yelp. I remember standing there for a moment, my heart pounding, thinking to myself, completely bewildered, what on earth that could have possibly been. And then, without any further warning, the clicking started again. This time it was coming from directly behind me, from the other side of that same tall wooden fence I had been walking alongside just moments before. Close enough now that it felt like whatever had been making that sound back at the softball field had somehow closed the distance between us entirely, following along parallel to my path this entire time. staying just out of sight behind whatever barrier happened to separate us at any given moment. That was the final straw for me. I did not stop to think, did not try to rationalize the sound one more time, did not attempt to convince myself that it was nothing. I simply ran as fast as I possibly could the rest of the way home, not daring to look back, not stopping until I was safely inside, with the door locked behind me. I have thought about that night countless times since it happened, turning over every possible explanation I can think of, trying to find some combination of ordinary, explainable events that would fully account for everything that occurred during that walk. Maybe it really was just some person, hiding in the darkness near the softball field, deliberately mimicking the clicking sound of my bottle cap as some kind of prank. Someone with a strange, cruel sense of humor who thought it would be funny to unsettle a random stranger walking home alone at night. Maybe the dog's yelp was completely unrelated, some unfortunate but ordinary accident happening at exactly the wrong moment to feel connected to everything else going on around me that night. Maybe the clicking sound near the wooden fence at the very end was simply an echo, some trick of sound bouncing strangely off the fence and nearby houses, making it seem like the noise had somehow moved impossibly quickly from one location to another. But none of these explanations have ever fully satisfied me. Not completely. Not in the way that would let me set this memory aside entirely as nothing more than an unusual, coincidental series of ordinary events. The timing of everything felt too deliberate, too responsive. The clicking always answering back at exactly the right moment, always seeming to track alongside my own movement rather than remaining fixed in one single location the way you would expect from an ordinary prankster hiding in one spot. And that dog's sudden, terrible yelp, cutting off so abruptly into total silence, has never sat right with me either, no matter how many times I try to write it off as pure coincidence. I still walk that same route home sometimes, even now, years after this all happened. And every single time I reach that particular stretch of road, that long S-curve climbing up the hill between the dark soccer field and the equally dark softball field, I find myself instinctively picking up my pace, just slightly, my hand occasionally drifting toward my pocket out of old habit, even though I stopped carrying around little metal bottle caps to play with a long time ago. Some small, persistent part of me still half expects, on any given dark night, to hear that same faint clicking sound answering back to me from somewhere out there in the shadows, waiting patiently to see whether I will be foolish enough to click back one more time. One night, I woke up suddenly to the sound of an extremely steady, consistent banging on my bedroom window. At first, still half caught in the fog of sleep, I assumed it had to be part of some dream, my mind simply constructing a strange sound effect the way dreams sometimes do, blending real-world sensations into whatever half-formed narrative my sleeping brain happened to be working through at the time. But as I woke up more fully, lying there in the dark, I realized with a growing sense of alarm that the banging was not part of any dream at all. It was real, happening right there in my actual bedroom, and it was so steady, so perfectly consistent in its rhythm that it genuinely did not sound like anything natural. It sounded, unmistakably, like it had to be a person, deliberately knocking against my window with a kind of mechanical, unwavering regularity that no random natural cause could easily replicate. For just a split second, lying there frozen in my bed, I actually considered getting up and pulling back my curtain to look outside and see what was causing it. But almost as quickly as that thought crossed my mind, I dismissed it completely. There was absolutely no way I was doing that alone, in the middle of the night, with something banging steadily against my window from the outside. Whatever bravery I might have mustered in daylight simply evaporated completely in that dark, quiet bedroom. Instead, I jolted out of bed as fast as I possibly could and rushed straight to my mother's room to wake her up, needing another person there with me immediately. Someone else to confirm that I was not imagining this. Someone else to help me figure out what on earth was happening. Even once we were both standing together in her room, we could still hear the banging clearly, carrying through the walls of the house from my bedroom, and it had not changed at all in its steady, unrelenting rhythm. It never missed a single beat, never sped up or slowed down, never paused even briefly the way you would expect an ordinary random noise to do at some point. The banging was so intense, in fact, that it was actually causing the windows throughout the entire house to shake slightly in their frames, a faint but unmistakable rattling that we could feel almost as much as hear. But even with that house-wide effect, it was clear that the sound was centralized specifically at my window, stronger and more immediate there than anywhere else in the house. My mother got up right away, and together we walked back toward my room to investigate more directly. When we reached my window and looked out through it, there was nothing visible outside at all. No person, no object, nothing that could obviously explain the sound. And yet the banging continued exactly as before, and my window itself was clearly, visibly shaking in its frame with each successive impact, even though there was nothing physically striking it that either of us could see. At this point, thoroughly unsettled and unable to make sense of what we were looking at, we decided the sound had to be coming from somewhere outside the house, despite the fact that nothing was visible through the window itself. I remember, in that moment, actually thinking, with a strange kind of escalating panic, that we might somehow be experiencing some sort of attack, as absurd as that sounds now looking back on it. The steady, rhythmic pounding almost reminding me of something like distant explosions or artillery fire, my mind reaching for any explanation, however unlikely, that might account for a sound this loud, this consistent, and this seemingly disconnected from any visible source. So we made the decision to go outside ourselves and check directly, stepping out into the night to see if we could locate whatever was causing all that noise. But once we were actually standing outside the house, there was nothing. Complete silence surrounded us. No banging at all. Nothing that would explain what we had just been hearing so clearly from inside just moments before. It was as if the sound simply did not exist out there at all, only inside the walls of the house itself. Realizing this, we went back inside, and it was only then that we figured out the banging was not actually coming from my window directly after all, despite how strongly it had seemed to be centered there. Instead, we traced it to a vent located directly below my window, a vent that led down into the basement of our house, a space that, for whatever reason, could only be accessed from outside the building rather than through any interior door or stairway. Neither one of us, understandably, had any interest in going outside again at 3 a.m. specifically to climb down into a dark basement and investigate the source of a strange, unexplained banging sound coming from a vent. That felt like an entirely unreasonable risk to take in the middle of the night, especially with no clear idea of what we might actually find down there. So instead, my mother called my father, who worked night shifts at the time and was not home with us, and explained the whole situation to him over the phone, describing the steady banging, the shaking windows, the vent, all of it. After talking it over together, we ultimately decided to try and pass the whole thing off as something mundane, maybe some issue with the house's pipes, or perhaps some kind of settling noise common in older homes, Anything that would let us go back to bed and get some kind of rest for the remainder of the night without having to fully confront how strange and unexplainable the whole experience had actually felt while it was happening. We never did figure out a real definitive explanation for what caused that banging that night. It has never been fully resolved, and unsettlingly, it is not even an isolated incident. That same steady, consistent banging still happens sometimes, even now, appearing every so often with no predictable pattern or clear trigger. Always with that same eerie, mechanical steadiness that makes it feel distinctly unnatural compared to whatever ordinary explanations we have tried to apply to it over the years. We eventually had the entire house inspected by a professional, specifically hoping to find some kind of structural or plumbing issue that could account for it. Some loose pipe, some mechanical component somewhere in the house that might vibrate or bang under certain conditions. But everything came back completely normal. Nothing was found to be wrong with the house at all. No structural issues, no plumbing problems, nothing mechanical that could reasonably explain a sound as loud, as steady, and as centralized as what we continue to experience from time to time. I still live in that same house, and I still hear that same banging every so often, always at night, always with that same unnervingly steady rhythm, never missing a beat, never speeding up or slowing down, exactly the same every single time it happens. I have gotten somewhat used to it over the years, in the sense that I no longer immediately panic the way I did that very first night, but I do not think I have ever fully stopped feeling a small jolt of unease each time it starts up again. Lying there in the dark, listening to that same relentless, unexplainable knocking, remembering that first night when my mother and I searched the entire house and the yard outside and found absolutely nothing that could account for it. Sometimes, late at night, when everything else in the house has gone quiet and I am lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I find myself unconsciously listening for it, half expecting, half dreading, that same steady banging to start up again from that same vent below my window. That same impossible, unwavering rhythm that no ordinary explanation has ever managed to fully account for. Not the inspectors, not my parents, not any theory any of us have ever come up with over all the years since that very first night it happened. I was spending Thanksgiving that particular year with my girlfriend, who I should mention was a bit of an unusual, somewhat eccentric person in her own right, and her mother, a woman who always struck me as fairly lonely, living alone in her house the way she did, clearly missing the kind of full, bustling family gatherings that a holiday like Thanksgiving is supposed to bring. We were having dinner at her mother's house that year, and if I am being completely honest, it was a fairly sad, muted little dinner overall, mostly assembled from store-bought sides and a pre-made turkey rather than anything homemade. The kind of holiday meal that feels a little hollow no matter how much effort everyone puts in to making it feel special. We were sitting there together, working our way through this modest little dinner, when the doorbell suddenly rang. My girlfriend's mother got up to answer it, and standing there on the front step were two police officers. They explained that they were going door to door through the neighborhood, asking about a van that had been parked around the corner from the house for several days in a row. Apparently, some of the neighbors had complained about it, unsure why this particular vehicle had been sitting there for so long without moving, and the police were simply following up on those complaints, checking with various homeowners in the area to see if anyone recognized the van or knew anything about who it might belong to. As they made their way around the neighborhood asking these questions, they had learned from some of the other neighbors that this same van had in fact been seen parked in front of my girlfriend's mother's house on previous occasions as well, from time to time, though apparently not consistently enough to have drawn much attention before now. When the officers asked her directly about it, my girlfriend's mother told them, without any hesitation, that she knew absolutely nothing about the van or who it might belong to. The police, seemingly satisfied with this answer, thanked her for her time and left to continue their questioning elsewhere in the neighborhood. But the very instant she closed the front door behind them, my girlfriend's mother spun around to face me, her expression suddenly shifting into something far more urgent and alarmed than anything I had seen from her all evening. "Oh my God," she said, her voice tight with sudden panic. "You have to check the basement." I did not fully understand what she meant by this at first, or why a random van parked around the corner would have anything at all to do with her basement, but the urgency in her voice was enough to get me moving immediately. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down into the dark, unfinished basement of the house, my girlfriend's mother following close behind me, clearly agitated, glancing around nervously as we descended the stairs together. The basement itself was fairly typical for an older house like this one, unfinished, with exposed concrete walls and support beams, various pieces of storage and old furniture scattered around in no particular order. The kind of space most homeowners use primarily for keeping things they no longer need upstairs, but are not quite ready to throw away entirely. As we made our way through this dim, cluttered space, sweeping the flashlight beam across different sections of the basement, we eventually came upon a small subsection near one side of the room where we found something that immediately struck both of us as deeply out of place. There, on the floor, was a mattress with a tangle of old, visibly dirty blankets sprawled messily across it. Next to this makeshift bed, an extension cord ran from a bare light bulb overhead down to a small television set sitting nearby, clearly rigged up as some kind of improvised living setup rather than anything that belonged in an ordinary basement storage area. The moment she saw this, my girlfriend's mother's face went pale, and she said, with a rising note of horror in her voice, "Oh my God, he's been living down here," before immediately turning and hurrying back up the stairs, apparently too frightened or overwhelmed to continue investigating any further herself. I stayed behind and continued looking around this section of the basement on my own, and the longer I looked, the more convinced I became that someone had indeed been living down there for some period of time. Scattered around the mattress and the little television setup were various food wrappers, several unfinished pizza boxes, and empty bottles, the accumulated debris of someone who had clearly been eating and sleeping in that exact spot for at least several days, if not considerably longer. But despite all of this evidence, there was no one actually present in that immediate area when I first arrived. Whoever had been living down there was, at least at that moment, apparently somewhere else. I continued exploring further into the basement, moving around a corner toward another section of the wall, sweeping my flashlight beam ahead of me as I went. As I got closer to an old boiler unit sitting against one wall, I aimed my flashlight into the narrow gap behind it, a space that could not have been more than about 12 inches wide between the boiler itself and the wall behind it. And there, standing pressed into that impossibly tight little space, was a man. He was scrawny, unshaven, his hair disheveled, and he was wearing absolutely nothing except a pair of boxers, standing there completely still, squeezed into that narrow gap in a way that must have been deeply uncomfortable to maintain for any length of time. As soon as my flashlight beam landed on him, he raised one finger slowly to his lips, silently telling me to keep quiet, his eyes wide with an expression of pure, desperate fear. It took me a moment, staring at him standing there in that tiny space, to fully process what I was looking at, and then it hit me with a jolt of recognition. I knew this man. He was my girlfriend's uncle, though he looked so different from how I remembered him. gaunt and unwell in a way that made him almost unrecognizable at first glance. It was immediately obvious to me that he was under the influence of drugs, his appearance and demeanor suggesting a level of physical deterioration that comes from prolonged substance abuse. And it was equally clear that he had apparently been homeless for some time, having secretly taken up residence in his own sister's basement without her knowledge, hiding there day after day, surviving on whatever food he could scrounge together, watching television on that small set he had rigged up, and apparently darting behind the boiler to hide himself completely whenever anyone came downstairs and risked discovering him. Standing there in that dim, cluttered basement, staring at this desperate, frightened man, silently begging me not to give away his hiding spot. I found myself facing an incredibly awkward and difficult decision. Upstairs, I could hear my girlfriend's mother repeatedly calling down, asking anxiously whether I had found anything, her voice tight with obvious anxiety about what might be lurking in her own basement. I did not want to completely destroy what was already a fairly sad, subdued Thanksgiving dinner by immediately revealing that her own brother had apparently been secretly living in her basement, using drugs, and hiding from her for who knows how long. It felt like far too much to unload on everyone in that particular moment, especially with dinner still sitting half-finished on the table upstairs, and the whole situation already tense enough from the earlier visit by the police. So, after a brief agonizing pause, I made the decision to go back upstairs and simply tell my girlfriend's mother that there had been no one down there at all, that whatever evidence we had found must have been left behind by someone who was no longer present, giving her at least a temporary, if entirely false, sense of reassurance rather than plunging the whole evening into immediate chaos and confrontation. It was only later, once we had left her mother's house and had some time alone together, that I finally told my girlfriend the full truth about what I had actually discovered down in that basement, about her uncle hiding there behind the boiler, half-dressed, clearly strung out and desperate, silently begging me not to expose him in that moment. I do not know exactly what happened after that, how the situation with her uncle was eventually resolved, whether her mother ever learned the full truth about what had really been happening beneath her own house, or what kind of help, if any, her uncle ultimately received afterward. Those details played out in ways I was not directly involved in, family matters that unfolded separately from my own part in the story. But I have never been able to fully shake the image of that man, standing pressed into that narrow 12-inch gap behind the boiler, his finger raised silently to his lips, his face carrying an expression of such raw, desperate fear and shame that it has stayed with me clearly ever since. It is not the kind of frightening image you typically associate with ghost stories or supernatural encounters. Nothing otherworldly or unexplainable about it at all. It was simply the sight of another human being, someone I actually knew, reduced to hiding half-naked in the dark, terrified of being discovered in his own family's basement. And that image, more than almost anything else I have ever witnessed, has remained permanently lodged in my memory, resurfacing every single time I think back on that particular Thanksgiving and the strange, unsettling discovery we made that evening. I have suffered from sleep paralysis for almost my entire life. It started when I was around 3 years old and continued every single night, without fail, all the way up until I turned 17. And even now, at 22, it still happens to me from time to time, though nowhere near as frequently as it used to during those early years. Over time, I learned certain tricks to try and protect myself from the worst effects of it, small mental techniques that helped me pull myself out of the experience before things got too bad. The most reliable one, for me at least, was noticing a very particular tingling sensation that would run up my spine in the dream, always occurring right before things took a serious turn for the worse, right before whatever torment was coming would actually begin. Whenever I felt that tingling start, I would use everything I had to force myself awake, cutting the episode off before it could fully take hold. Outside of all this, I want to be clear that I consider myself a fairly ordinary person. I am just a normal English guy, currently at university, with a wonderful girlfriend, a part-time job to help cover my expenses, all the completely unremarkable trappings of an ordinary young adult life. But underneath all of that ordinary surface, I have always carried this other side of myself, something darker, something shaped by decades of nightly battles with an affliction that most people never have to deal with even once in their entire lives, let alone every single night for over a decade. What I want to tell you about now is the one time my absolute worst fears surrounding this condition were finally realized in the most horrifying way imaginable. I was 17 years old at the time, and life in general was going remarkably well for me. I had just earned my second-degree black belt, a genuine accomplishment I was incredibly proud of after years of dedicated training. My schoolwork was going well, too, everything seeming to align in a way that felt, for the first time in a long while, genuinely hopeful. Even better, the intensity and frequency of my night terrors had actually started to subside during this period, growing noticeably less severe and less frequent than they had been throughout my childhood and early teenage years. I remember feeling, during that particular stretch of time, more free than I had felt in years, like some heavy cloud that had been hanging over my entire life for as long as I could remember was finally beginning to lift, letting actual rays of hope shine through into my life for the first time in a very long while. That feeling of hope and relief came crashing down entirely on one particular night, when I experienced the single worst night terror I have ever had in my entire life, an episode that would end up changing everything about how I understood my own condition and what it was truly capable of. The dream itself started off fairly mild, almost peaceful compared to what I was used to. I found myself standing in a hallway, surrounded by a group of other people, the setting vague and dreamlike the way these things often are, not tied to any specific real location I could identify. Everything felt calm at first, unremarkable, the kind of gentle, low-stakes dream sequence that could have belonged to anyone. And then, suddenly, I felt it. That familiar tingling sensation began creeping up my spine, the exact warning signal I had relied on for years to pull myself back to wakefulness before things turned dark. Except this time, the feeling completely engulfed me, spreading through my entire body with an intensity I had never experienced before, and despite everything I tried, I found myself completely unable to wake up. My usual escape mechanism, the one trick that had reliably saved me from countless previous episodes, simply failed to work this time. Within the dream, everyone else's attention suddenly turned toward a staircase nearby, where something had begun slowly climbing upward, one step at a time. With every single step this presence took, I felt my fear deepen further and further, an overwhelming, suffocating dread building steadily inside me, until finally it reached the top step, and I saw it clearly for the first time. What happened next in that dream was something I can only describe as living through my own murder. I experienced, in agonizing, excruciating detail, the entire sensation of being killed by this monstrous figure, every horrifying moment of it playing out with a vividness that felt disturbingly, impossibly real, far beyond anything an ordinary nightmare typically produces. And then, suddenly, I woke up. I immediately recognized the familiar symptoms of sleep paralysis settling over me the moment I regained some level of consciousness. the total inability to move any part of my body, the deeply unsettling hallucination still lingering at the edges of my vision, the crushing sense of dread pressing down over everything, and that particular heavy weight sitting directly on my chest that so often accompanies these episodes, making even breathing feel like an effort. It was in that moment, lying there paralyzed, that I noticed something different about this particular episode compared to every other one I had experienced throughout my life. The figure standing over my bed was not moving the way the other hallucinatory figures usually did during my typical sleep paralysis episodes, the scuttling, erratic, unsettling movements I had grown used to seeing over the years. This figure was different. He simply stood there, completely still, staring directly at me. His eyes were bulging unnaturally, wide and fixed on me with an intensity that felt genuinely alive rather than the usual dreamlike quality my hallucinations typically carried. The look of pure, undiluted hatred etched across his face burned itself permanently into my memory in that moment, an image so disturbing that it would go on to become a central, recurring feature in the nightmares that plagued me for a long time after that night. As the rest of the hallucinatory figures and dreamlike distortions around him gradually faded away, the way they always eventually did during my usual episodes, he remained, completely present, completely fixed in place, staring at me with that same terrible expression the entire time. Slowly, deliberately, he began raising his hand. A thin sliver of moonlight was filtering in through a small crack in my bedroom curtains at that exact moment, and it caught against something he was holding, illuminating the sharp, unmistakable edge of an object clutched in his raised hand. I remained completely paralyzed, my eyes wide open, staring directly at this horrifying figure looming over me, utterly unable to move, unable to scream, unable to do anything at all except watch as his arms suddenly swung downward. Everything went completely black after that. The next thing I remember is waking up the following morning to the sound of my father's voice nearby. This in itself was not unusual, since my dad was typically the one who woke me up most mornings anyway. But there was something different in the tone of his voice this particular morning. A distinct strain running through it. An anxious edge that I picked up on immediately, even before I had fully opened my eyes. I considered this strange for a moment, trying to piece together why he might sound so unsettled, until I became aware of my actual surroundings and realized, with a jolt, exactly where I was. I was in a hospital. It turned out that the evil figure I had seen looming over my bed that night had, in fact, been entirely real. He had physically stabbed me in the leg during that episode. The sharp object I had seen catching the moonlight turning out to be an actual knife, wielded by an actual person who had somehow gained access to my bedroom in the middle of the night. My father had discovered him there, still in my room, and had physically fought him off, subduing him before calling the police to come and take him away. As the full story eventually came out afterward, it turned out that this man was actually a friend of my mother's, someone who had apparently been struggling with serious, undiagnosed mental illness, and who, disturbingly, had also attacked another child on a separate occasion before fleeing the scene of that earlier incident as well. Whatever twisted impulse had driven him that night, he had somehow made his way into our house, into my own bedroom, and had stood over me exactly as I had perceived him within my sleep paralysis episode, holding that knife before finally acting on whatever violent intention had brought him there in the first place. I still carry the scar on my leg today from where he plunged that knife into me all those years ago. A permanent physical reminder of a night that started off feeling like nothing more than another difficult sleep paralysis episode, among the countless others I had already endured throughout my childhood, but which turned out to be something far more dangerous and far more real than anything I had ever previously experienced. I think about that night often, even now, years later. For the vast majority of my life, my sleep paralysis episodes had always followed the same general pattern: terrifying hallucinations, oppressive dread, figures moving in strange, disjointed ways at the edges of my vision, none of it ever actually physically present in the room with me. All of it confined entirely to whatever twisted state my brain constructs during those transitional moments between sleep and wakefulness. That single night shattered my understanding of exactly where the line between hallucination and reality actually sits, teaching me, in the most brutal and frightening way imaginable, that sometimes what you perceive during those episodes might not be entirely a trick of the mind after all. It has taken a long time to fully process everything that happened that night, to separate the genuine physical danger I was actually in from the layers of hallucinatory horror my sleep paralysis had wrapped around the experience, blending an already terrifying condition with something that turned out to be a very real, very immediate physical threat. For a long time afterward, I struggled significantly with even more intense night terrors than I had ever experienced before, my mind seemingly needing to process and relive what had happened through an even darker, more elaborate series of nightmares. Almost as though some part of my subconscious understood that ordinary sleep paralysis had failed to properly warn me that night, and was now overcompensating by making every subsequent episode even more intense and vivid than before. Slowly, over time, with the support of my family, and eventually with proper therapy and counseling to help me work through the lingering trauma of that experience, things did improve. The frequency and intensity of my episodes did gradually decrease again, much the same way they had before that terrible night, though I do not think they have ever fully returned to quite the same level of calm and manageable frequency I briefly experienced right before everything happened. I want to say clearly, for anyone else out there who deals with sleep paralysis themselves, that I am not trying to suggest every hallucination experienced during an episode represents some kind of genuine physical danger lurking in the room with you. The overwhelming majority of what people experience during sleep paralysis is exactly what medical science says it is: a natural, if deeply unsettling, neurological phenomenon that occurs during the transition between sleeping and waking states, producing vivid, often frightening hallucinations that have no actual physical basis in reality. My own experience, in that sense, was a genuine rarity, an incredibly unlucky coincidence of timing that placed an actual physically present threat directly into the middle of an already terrifying sleep paralysis episode. But I do think it is worth remembering and worth sharing that sometimes, in exceptionally rare circumstances, not everything you perceive during one of these episodes can be automatically dismissed as pure hallucination. My own experience taught me that lesson in the most brutal, unforgettable way possible. A lesson I would never wish on anyone else, but one that has fundamentally shaped how I think about my own condition ever since. I live a completely normal life these days. I have moved on significantly from that night, even though the memory of it and the physical scar it left behind on my leg will likely stay with me for the rest of my life in one form or another. I am set to graduate from university in just a few months now, continuing forward with my education, my relationship, my part-time job, all the ordinary threads of an ordinary young adult life. But every so often, especially on nights when my sleep paralysis does return, even now in my early 20s, I still find myself watching very carefully for any sign of stillness among whatever hallucinatory figures happen to appear, remembering that one particular night when stillness rather than the usual scuttling movement, turned out to mean something far more dangerous than anything I had previously understood my condition to be capable of producing. Looking back on everything now, from the distance of several years, I find myself thinking a great deal about the sheer improbability of what happened to me that night. Sleep paralysis on its own is already a fairly well documented, if still not entirely understood, neurological experience, one that affects a surprisingly large number of people at some point in their lives, usually briefly and occasionally, rather than nightly across more than a decade the way it affected me throughout my childhood. The particular hallucinations people describe experiencing during these episodes tend to follow certain recognizable patterns as well. Shadowy figures at the edges of vision, a crushing weight on the chest, an overwhelming sense of danger or dread. All of it produced by a brain that is technically still partially caught in a dream state, even as parts of the body and consciousness have already begun to wake up. For the vast, overwhelming majority of people who experience this, myself included for almost the entirety of my life, up until that one night, none of it corresponds to any actual physical danger in the room. It is simply the mind processing a strange, temporary disconnect between sleeping and waking, manifesting that disconnect as fear and monstrous imagery. What still unsettles me most, even now, is trying to understand exactly how the timing lined up the way it did. I have spent countless hours since that night wondering whether some part of me, on some subconscious level, actually did perceive that intruder's real physical presence in my room before my conscious mind ever caught up to it. Whether the unusual stillness of that particular figure, so different from the scuttling, erratic hallucinations I was used to, was actually my sleeping brain attempting, in its own strange and limited way, to process and warn me about an actual physical threat that had entered my room. It is an unsettling thought, the idea that our minds might occasionally be capable of perceiving real danger even while trapped in that in-between state of sleep paralysis, folding genuine threats into the same hallucinatory framework that normally only produces harmless, if terrifying, imaginary horrors. My parents, understandably, were absolutely devastated when they learned the full truth of what had happened that night, and in the months that followed, there was a great deal of difficult conversation within our family about how someone my mother considered a friend could have been struggling with such severe, undiagnosed mental illness without any of us recognizing the warning signs beforehand. I do not know all the details of exactly how she knew him, or how long that friendship had gone on before that night, and honestly, I have never wanted to press her too hard for those particular details, understanding that the guilt she carried afterward, however unwarranted it truly was, remained a difficult and painful subject for her for a long time. The recovery process, both physically and emotionally, took considerably longer than I initially expected it to. The physical wound itself healed in a relatively ordinary time frame, leaving behind the scar I still carry on my leg today, a faint but permanent reminder embedded directly into my skin. The emotional and psychological recovery, however, stretched on for years afterward, manifesting itself through those intensified night terrors I mentioned before, nightmares that took the already disturbing figure I had seen that night and elaborated on him even further, giving him new, increasingly horrifying variations each time he reappeared in my dreams over the months that followed. Eventually, with the help of a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, I began to make real progress in separating the two distinct layers of that experience: the genuine physical trauma of having been attacked and injured by an actual person, and the pre-existing psychological condition of my sleep paralysis, which had simply happened to intersect with that trauma in the most uniquely terrifying way imaginable. Learning to process those two things separately, rather than allowing them to remain permanently fused together into one single overwhelming source of fear, made an enormous difference in my ability to eventually move forward with my life. I also want to mention that my black belt training, strangely enough, played a small but meaningful role in my recovery process as well. Returning to the discipline and physical confidence that martial arts had given me before that night helped me slowly rebuild a sense of control over my own body and my own physical safety, something that had been so violently and completely stripped away from me during those brief, horrifying moments when I lay completely paralyzed, watching that knife descend toward me with absolutely no ability to defend myself or move out of the way. These days, my sleep paralysis episodes are far less frequent than they once were, though they have never disappeared entirely, and I doubt at this point that they ever fully will. When they do occur now, they almost always follow the more typical familiar pattern I experienced for most of my life before that one particular night. Fleeting, unsettling hallucinations that fade away naturally within a minute or two. Nothing more than my own overactive transitional brain producing temporary shadows and imagined threats that dissolve harmlessly once full consciousness properly returns. But I would be lying if I said that every single time it happens now, even all these years later, some small part of me does not brace itself just slightly, watching carefully to see whether whatever figure appears this time will move the way they normally do, or whether, instead, it will simply stand there, perfectly still, staring back at me the way he did. Back in 2006, when I was 21 years old, I moved into a new apartment located just around the corner from a very old church, one that had its own attached cemetery. And directly opposite that church sat a large public park that had actually once been a cemetery itself, long before it was converted into open green space for the community. I always assumed the local council must have decided at some point to reclaim that land for public use, turning what had once been a burial ground into something more practical for the neighborhood, though they had clearly left certain remnants of its original purpose intact, since old weathered headstones still lined the walls surrounding the park. A quiet, lingering reminder of what that space used to be. Separating the park from the back of the church was a footpath, one that a lot of local residents used regularly as a convenient shortcut between different parts of the neighborhood. During the daytime, this path stayed fairly busy, well used by people cutting through on their way to somewhere else, and it was well lit along its entire length. At night, however, that same path grew noticeably quiet, the kind of quiet that makes an otherwise ordinary shortcut feel a little more unsettling once the sun goes down and most people are already home for the evening. On the third night after I had first moved into that apartment, my younger sister, who was 19 at the time, and I were making one final trip to bring the last of our belongings over, hauling a couple of large suitcases along with us as we walked from the nearby tube station toward my new apartment. As we approached the area near the old church, I found myself considering which route to take, either the quiet, more direct back path running behind the church, or the longer route around the front of the building instead. I ended up suggesting we take the front route, walking directly past the main entrance of the church rather than cutting through along the quieter back path. I remember feeling a little nervous about the idea of two young women walking alone through a dimly lit, empty shortcut late at night, and reasoned that the front of the church, situated right alongside a large, busy main road, would be a safer option, given how brightly lit that main road was from the surrounding streetlights, and how much regular traffic passed along it even at that hour. I was wrong about that decision turning out to be the safer choice. Just as we passed by the front entrance of the church itself, I noticed an elderly woman standing there, someone who looked to be in her 80s, shuffling slowly toward the church building, her back turned toward us as we approached. Nearby, I could see her mobility scooter parked close to where she was standing, though she herself was walking rather than riding it at that particular moment. She was dressed entirely in white from head to toe, a white t-shirt, white shorts, white shoes, and even her hair, visible beneath the dim ambient light, appeared to be completely white as well. Despite the fact that the main road right beside us was brightly illuminated by a steady row of working streetlights, none of that light actually reached into the church's own compound. There were quite a few trees surrounding the property, their branches and leaves apparently blocking whatever light might otherwise have spilled over from the road, leaving the entire area directly in front of the church bathed almost completely in darkness. A stark, unsettling contrast to the well-lit road running immediately alongside it. It was around 9 in the evening at this point, still relatively early by most standards, though clearly late enough that I found myself silently wondering why exactly there was an elderly woman standing alone in front of a dark, empty church at that particular hour. Before I even had the chance to fully process that question in my own mind, she suddenly began laughing. It came out of absolutely nowhere. No warning, no build-up. Just this sudden, piercing, almost manic cackle. The kind of laugh you might imagine coming from some kind of storybook witch, rather than an ordinary elderly woman standing quietly by herself outside a church at night. Even though the main road right next to us remained busy with a steady stream of passing traffic, that entire ambient noise somehow felt strangely muted and distant, the instant her laughter filled the air around us, as if her voice alone had the power to momentarily override everything else happening nearby. I did not hesitate for even a second. I told my sister urgently to just go, quickly, right now, and we immediately picked up our pace, practically running while still trying to manage our heavy suitcases at the same time. But her laughter did not stop. If anything, it grew louder and more intense as we hurried away, taking on an increasingly frantic, almost hysterical quality the further we moved from where she was standing. I did not dare look back over my shoulder even once. It genuinely felt, in that moment, as though her laughter itself was actively following us, almost as if she had somehow lifted off the ground entirely and was now chasing us directly through the trees lining that dark compound. No matter how quickly we moved, her laugh remained just as loud, lingering persistently right behind us the entire way, refusing to fade no matter how much distance I felt we were putting between ourselves and the church. I have never in my life felt fear quite like what I experienced during those frantic few minutes. Dragging my suitcase along as fast as I possibly could, my sister right beside me, both of us moving as quickly as our legs and our luggage would allow. In the middle of all of this, as if the situation were not already terrifying enough, some random cyclist happened to be riding toward us along the pavement, and apparently thought it would be funny to try and scare us further by suddenly shouting "boo" as he passed by. Under any normal circumstance, this would have simply been an obnoxious, mildly startling prank from a stranger. In that particular moment, already thoroughly terrified and fleeing from something we could not fully explain, his sudden shout only escalated our fear even further, adding one more jolt of adrenaline to what was already an overwhelming flood of terror. We finally made it back to the main entrance of our apartment building, and by the time we arrived, the laughter had thankfully stopped completely. Both of us turned around to look behind us, back toward the direction we had just come from, and there was absolutely nobody there. No elderly woman, no scooter, no sign of anyone at all along the path we had just fled down. Relieved beyond words to finally be back somewhere that felt safe, we hurried inside the building. Once we were safely indoors, I turned to my sister and asked her, somewhat hesitantly, whether she had seen the same thing I had, half convinced that I had somehow imagined the entire encounter myself, my own mind constructing some kind of irrational fear out of nothing more than an ordinary elderly woman standing quietly outside a church. She told me immediately that no, I was not imagining things, that she had seen and heard the exact same old woman herself, confirming that the entire terrifying experience had genuinely happened to both of us simultaneously. Still thoroughly shaken, I tried nervously to laugh the whole thing off, attempting to lighten the mood now that we were finally back somewhere safe. But right at that exact moment, the doorbell to the apartment suddenly rang, and I let out an absolutely piercing scream, loud enough that it must have sounded like something out of a horror film itself. Because this was an old apartment building that we had only just moved into days earlier, the doorbell itself was this ancient, incredibly loud, harsh buzzer, the kind of grating, mechanical sound that sends a genuine chill down your spine under the best of circumstances, let alone immediately after having just fled from something as terrifying as what we had just experienced outside. It was, in fact, the very first time I had ever heard that particular doorbell go off since moving in, and of all the nights for me to hear it for the first time, it happened to be this one. My sister went over and opened the door, and standing there was our father, who had come by the apartment for some reason that evening. He took one look at me standing there in the hallway, already completely undone, crying and clearly in the middle of some kind of full-blown panic, and immediately became annoyed, demanding to know what on earth was wrong with me. Still sobbing, gasping for breath between words, I managed to explain that he had simply scared me badly by ringing that horrible, unfamiliar doorbell. He laughed at this explanation and pulled me into a hug, clearly relieved that nothing more serious than a loud doorbell had caused my sudden outburst. I do not believe I ever told him the actual full story of what had really happened that night. The elderly woman in white, her horrifying laughter, the terrifying chase back to the apartment. It felt like too much to explain in that moment, and honestly, I am not sure I ever fully explained it to him at any point afterward either. After that single night, I never once walked along the front of that church again, no matter what time of day it happened to be. From that point forward, I always took the quieter back path instead. The same path I had originally been nervous about walking down in the first place. The one I had specifically avoided that particular night because I thought it would be more dangerous for two young women to walk alone. As it turned out, my fear had been entirely misplaced regarding which route posed the greater risk. I never wanted to find out whether that elderly woman had been something genuinely real, some strange, unsettling, but ultimately ordinary person who simply happened to laugh in an unusually frightening way that night, or something else entirely, something I did not want to think too hard about identifying. And more than anything else, I never wanted to discover what might have happened if she had actually turned around at any point during that encounter and looked directly at either my sister or me. To this day, whenever I happen to walk anywhere near that old church, even years later, I instinctively steer well clear of its front entrance, choosing the quieter, longer route instead, never willing to risk finding out what waits there in the dark compound between those old, weathered headstones, hidden just beyond the reach of the streetlights along that busy, brightly lit road. In the days and weeks that followed that night, I found myself thinking about the whole encounter constantly, replaying every single detail over and over in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation that would let me set the memory aside and stop dwelling on it so heavily. I told myself, more than once, that it was probably nothing more than an ordinary elderly woman, perhaps someone dealing with dementia or some other condition that made her behavior seem more erratic and unsettling than it would have from someone fully in command of their faculties. Elderly people sometimes do laugh unexpectedly, sometimes talk to themselves, sometimes behave in ways that can seem strange or startling to a passing stranger who does not understand the full context of what they are dealing with. It would have been easy enough, in theory, to write the whole thing off using that kind of reasonable, compassionate explanation. But no matter how many times I tried to reason my way into that more comfortable, mundane interpretation, certain details always managed to pull me right back out of it. The particular quality of her laugh, for one thing, was unlike anything I had ever heard before or since. Not the ordinary, if occasionally startling, laughter of an elderly person amused by something private and unknown to us, but something sharper, more piercing, almost deliberately aimed in our direction the moment we passed by. And then there was the strange muffling effect it seemed to have on the surrounding noise of the busy road right beside us, as though her voice alone had some power to dampen everything else happening around it. An effect that no ordinary human laughter, however loud or unusual, should have realistically been capable of producing. I also could not stop thinking about the darkness of that particular compound. How strange it was that, despite being situated directly alongside one of the busiest, most brightly lit roads in that entire part of the neighborhood, none of that ambient light managed to penetrate even a few feet into the church grounds themselves. I have walked past plenty of similarly tree-lined properties since then, plenty of spaces with dense foliage positioned near well-lit streets, and none of them have ever struck me as being quite so completely, unnaturally dark as that particular compound felt that night. It was as though the darkness there existed almost independently of the lighting conditions everywhere else nearby. A small, self-contained pocket of shadow that refused to be touched by the same illumination flooding every other part of the surrounding area. My sister and I have talked about that night many times over the years since it happened, usually whenever the conversation among family or friends drifts toward unexplainable personal experiences. The kind of casual late-night conversation where everyone eventually ends up sharing their own version of a story just like this one. Every single time we revisit it together, both of us still agree completely on the core details. The old woman dressed entirely in white, her back turned toward us as we approached, the mobility scooter parked nearby, and above everything else, that horrifying, piercing laughter that seemed to chase us the entire way back to the apartment that night. Neither of us has ever been able to offer the other any kind of satisfying, definitive explanation for what actually happened. We have joked about it sometimes. In the lighter, more distant way, you eventually learn to joke about things that terrified you badly enough at the time, but have since faded into more comfortable, retellable territory. But underneath that joking, I do not think either of us has ever fully shaken the genuine unease that memory still carries, even all these years later. I ended up living in that same apartment for a little over 2 years before eventually moving elsewhere, and in all that time, I never once encountered that same woman again. Not walking near the church, not anywhere else in the surrounding neighborhood, despite passing by that general area regularly throughout my entire time living there. I asked around occasionally, in the kind of casual, offhand way you might bring up a strange local rumor to see if anyone else recognized it, whether any of my other neighbors had ever seen or heard of an elderly woman matching that particular description. Someone dressed entirely in white, known for spending time near the church at night. Nobody I ever asked seemed to recognize the description at all, and after a while I stopped bringing it up entirely, not wanting to seem as though I were chasing after some kind of urban legend everyone else considered nothing more than an overactive imagination working through the ordinary unease of walking near an old cemetery late at night. Even now, so many years removed from that particular apartment and that particular neighborhood, I still think about that night far more often than I probably should. Whenever I happen to pass by any old church, especially one surrounded by dense trees or situated near some kind of cemetery, I find myself instinctively glancing toward the shadows along its edges, half expecting, in some small, persistent corner of my mind, to catch sight of that same figure again, dressed entirely in white, standing perfectly still, with her back turned toward me, waiting silently for the moment I finally draw close enough for her to finally, at long last, turn around. I have since told this story to a handful of close friends over the years, usually late at night. Usually in the kind of setting where people naturally start trading their own strange, unexplainable experiences back and forth. Almost every single time, whoever I am telling it to asks the same obvious question: whether I ever tried going back during the daytime to see the church and its grounds under more ordinary, better lit conditions. Just to reassure myself that it really was nothing more than an unusual old woman and a trick of poor lighting. And the truth is, I did go back plenty of times afterward, always during the day, always with other people around, and the church itself, in full daylight, always looked exactly the way you would expect any ordinary old church and its accompanying cemetery grounds to look. Quiet, a little worn down by age, but completely unremarkable in every other sense. That, in some strange way, has always unsettled me even further, rather than reassuring me. If the church grounds had continued to feel genuinely sinister, even in broad daylight, it would almost be easier to write off the whole experience as simply the natural result of walking past an inherently creepy location late at night, my mind filling in the blanks with fear because the setting itself practically invited that kind of reaction. But it never felt that way during the day. It felt like an entirely ordinary, forgettable little church, nothing about it suggesting anything remotely unusual or threatening in the slightest, which has always left me with the unsettling conclusion that whatever I experienced that night was tied specifically to that particular hour, that particular darkness, and whatever, or whoever, was waiting there only under those very specific conditions. I do not tell this particular story very often, mostly because I am fully aware of just how unbelievable it sounds when I try to explain it to people, but I promise you, every single word of it is completely true. When I was younger, my friend and I used to go out driving together late at night specifically to try and scare ourselves. The kind of pointless, slightly reckless activity that teenagers sometimes get into simply because they are bored and have not yet developed a proper sense of caution about where exactly they should or should not be driving after dark. We would deliberately seek out abandoned roads, drive through heavily wooded, isolated areas, anywhere that felt sufficiently creepy and remote to give us that little thrill of manufactured fear. Looking back on it now as an adult, I fully recognize just how genuinely unwise this habit of ours actually was, but at the time, it felt like a fun, harmless way to pass a boring evening. I should also mention, since it is directly relevant to everything that happened, that I grew up in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, a location that happens to be only about a 5-minute drive away from the farm that once belonged to the convicted serial killer Robert Pickton, the site where he was found to have murdered numerous women over an extended period of time before finally being caught and imprisoned. By the time the events of this story took place, he had already been in jail for quite a while, but the farm itself remained standing exactly as it always had, easily visible from the road if you happened to drive past it, a fact that plenty of people in the local area were well aware of. One particular night, driven by nothing more than a kind of morbid curiosity that eventually got the better of both of us, my friend and I decided we would take a drive past that same farm, just to look at it. Nothing more elaborate or intentional than that. It was around 2 in the morning by that point, and the streets throughout the entire area were completely empty. Not another car or person in sight anywhere along our route. We drove past the farm slowly, taking our time to actually look at the property as we passed. The first thing that caught our attention were these enormous piles of gravel sitting on the property, each one standing somewhere between 10 and 15 feet tall, towering unusually high compared to what you might normally expect from an ordinary residential or agricultural property. And then, perched right on top of one of these massive gravel piles, we noticed something distinctly out of place. A small school chair, the specific kind of miniature, child-sized chair typically found in elementary school classrooms. Both of us found this small detail a little strange and unsettling. An oddly specific, oddly small object, sitting completely alone atop a massive pile of gravel in the middle of the night outside a property with such a dark, well-known history attached to it. But at the time, neither of us thought too seriously about it, chalking it up as simply one more strange, slightly unsettling detail among the many other unusual things you might expect to find scattered around any abandoned or under-maintained property. We continued along until we reached the end of that particular road, at which point we made a U-turn to start heading back the way we had come, planning to head home after having satisfied our curiosity about the farm. As we made our way back past the property a second time, we slowed down again deliberately, wanting to get one more look at that strange, oddly placed little chair sitting up there on the gravel pile. I want to emphasize again, because it matters significantly for everything that happened next, that this entire area was completely dead at that hour, utterly empty of any other people or vehicles. We had not passed a single other living soul anywhere along that stretch of road, not during our initial drive past the property, and not during the time it took us to reach the end of the road and turn back around. As we slowed down to take another look at the chair, some small flicker of movement in my rearview mirror suddenly caught my attention. I glanced over at the mirror, and my entire body went cold with an instant, overwhelming rush of fear. There, directly behind us, was an enormous truck, its headlights completely switched off, positioned so close to our bumper that it was literally only inches away from making contact with our car. I was so completely frozen with fear in that moment that I could barely manage to force any words out of my mouth at all. But somehow I managed to shriek out an urgent command to my friend, telling her to step on the gas immediately. She had not yet noticed the truck herself, but the moment I said this, she glanced in her own mirror and immediately understood the situation, slamming her foot down on the accelerator without any hesitation at all. As we desperately tried to speed away from whatever was following us, the truck behind us matched our acceleration almost instantly, closing the distance right back down to our bumper within just a few seconds, refusing to fall behind no matter how quickly we tried to put distance between us. I do not think I have ever, in my entire life, before or since, felt a level of terror comparable to what I experienced during those next few seconds. Watching that massive, dark, headlight-less truck stay locked onto our bumper no matter how fast we drove, both of us screaming and panicking, desperately trying to figure out how to escape whatever was chasing us through those empty, silent streets in the middle of the night. We finally reached the end of that particular road, and at the last possible second, we turned sharply to the left, while the truck behind us, instead of following our turn, veered off in the opposite direction, turning right and disappearing from view almost as suddenly and completely as it had first appeared behind us in the first place. We drove the rest of the way home in a state of complete, uncontrollable shaking, both of us trying desperately to process and make sense of whatever had just happened, replaying the entire sequence of events over and over in our minds, trying to understand who or what had just been chasing us so relentlessly through those empty streets. And more importantly, why? Once we finally made it home safely, we ended up telling my brother the entire story, still visibly shaken by the whole experience. He listened carefully, and then mentioned, half joking, but clearly at least partially serious as well, that Robert Picton's own brother still lives somewhere in that same general area, suggesting, almost as a dark joke, that perhaps it had been the brother himself who had chased us away from the old crime scene that night. To this day, I genuinely have no idea who or what was actually driving that truck, why it had its headlights completely switched off, or why it chose to follow us so aggressively and so closely along that particular stretch of empty road at 2 in the morning. But in the back of my mind, ever since that night, I have never quite been able to shake my brother's half-joking suggestion, wondering, every time I think back on that terrifying chase, whether it really could have been the surviving brother of a notorious serial killer, patrolling the area around his family's old, infamous property, chasing off anyone foolish enough to go looking for a thrill near a place with such a genuinely horrific history attached to it. It has been years since that night happened, and I have gone over every detail of it countless times since, trying to find some kind of ordinary, explainable reason for everything that took place. Maybe it really was nothing more than some random local resident, annoyed at seeing two unfamiliar teenagers slowly cruising past the property in the middle of the night, choosing to scare us off in an aggressive but ultimately harmless way, rather than confronting us directly. Maybe the driver had some entirely unrelated reason of their own for being out on that road at that particular hour, and our own panicked, adrenaline-fueled minds simply interpreted an ordinary close encounter as something far more sinister and deliberate than it actually was. But no matter how many times I try to reason my way through it, using those calmer, more rational explanations, I have never been able to fully shake the specific, deeply unsettling details of that night. The headlights being completely off felt deliberate rather than accidental, a choice made specifically to avoid being noticed until the truck was already right behind us. The speed and precision with which it matched our own acceleration, staying locked on to our bumper no matter how quickly we tried to escape, felt far too controlled and intentional to have been some random coincidence. And the location itself, directly outside a property with such a notorious, horrifying history, has always made the entire experience feel like something more than a simple case of an irritated local resident scaring off some nosy teenagers. I have never gone back to drive past that property again since that night, not out of any lingering fear of ghosts or supernatural presences, but simply because the memory of that truck, silent and dark, appearing out of nowhere and chasing us so relentlessly through those empty streets, has remained frightening enough on its own, without needing any additional supernatural explanation attached to it. Whoever or whatever was behind the wheel of that truck that night, I have no interest in ever encountering them again. And I have made absolutely sure, in all the years since, to never again find myself driving anywhere near that same stretch of road after dark. I think a lot, even now, about why exactly my friend and I were so drawn to that particular kind of activity back then, deliberately seeking out isolated, abandoned locations at night, purely for the thrill of scaring ourselves. I suppose there is something about being a teenager, that particular stretch of life where you feel simultaneously invincible and desperately bored, that makes genuinely reckless behavior seem exciting rather than dangerous. We had done this kind of thing plenty of times before that particular night, driving slowly down dark, wooded roads, parking near supposedly haunted locations, always chasing that same little rush of manufactured fear, always coming home afterward laughing about how silly and harmless the whole thing had been. That night was different from every other one before it. and it fundamentally changed how I thought about that entire hobby of ours going forward. I have also spent a lot of time thinking about that strange little school chair sitting on top of the gravel pile, trying to figure out whether it had any actual connection to what happened afterward, or whether it was simply an unrelated coincidental detail that our minds later linked together with the truck chase, purely because both things happened during the same unsettling night. Looking back, there could be a dozen mundane explanations for why a small chair like that ended up sitting on a pile of gravel outside that particular property. Maybe it had simply been discarded there by whoever currently owned or maintained the land, tossed aside during some unrelated cleanup or construction project happening on the property. Maybe kids from the neighborhood had left it there themselves at some earlier point, using the gravel piles as a makeshift play area during the daytime before we ever happened to drive past that night. There is no reason, logically, to assume any deeper connection between that chair and the property's dark history, or between the chair and the truck that chased us only minutes later. And yet, I would be lying if I said that small, oddly specific detail has not stuck with me just as vividly as the truck chase itself over all these years since. There was something about seeing a chair clearly meant for a small child, sitting alone at night on top of an enormous mound of gravel outside a property with such a horrific, well-documented history that has never quite left my mind, regardless of how many perfectly reasonable, mundane explanations I have tried to apply to it since. My friend and I have talked about that night many times over the years since it happened. Usually, whenever the conversation among old friends drifts toward strange, unexplainable personal experiences, the kind of casual late-night storytelling session where everyone eventually shares their own version of an experience, just like this one. Every single time we bring it up together, both of us still agree completely on every major detail. The gravel piles, the small chair, the truck's headlights being completely switched off, the way it matched our speed so precisely, no matter how fast we tried to drive away. Neither of us has ever managed to convince the other, or ourselves, of any single explanation that fully accounts for everything that happened that night. I did eventually do a little bit of research on my own into the general history and layout of that property, curious to understand more about it after everything that had happened. I learned that the land had gone through various changes of ownership and use in the years following Picton's arrest and conviction, portions of it eventually being repurposed or redeveloped in various ways as the years went on. I do not know for certain whether the specific piles of gravel we saw that night were part of some ongoing construction or landscaping project happening on the property at that particular time, though it seems like a reasonably likely explanation given how common it is for land to undergo various phases of development and use over the years, especially once its original, notorious purpose had ended. As for the truck itself and whoever might have been driving it, I have never had any way of finding out anything more concrete. I never got a look at the driver, never saw a license plate, never caught any details at all beyond the sheer size and darkness of the vehicle itself, and the terrifying, mechanical precision with which it stayed locked onto our bumper throughout the entire chase. My brother's half-joking suggestion about Picton's own brother still living in the area has always stuck with me, more than perhaps it should, given how little actual evidence exists to connect that specific truck to that specific person. But something about the timing, the location, and the sheer aggressive intensity of that chase has always made that particular explanation feel less far-fetched to me than it probably should, even all these years later. I do not go looking for that kind of thrill anymore, the deliberate seeking out of dark, abandoned, unsettling locations, purely for the sake of manufactured fear. Whatever excitement I once found in that particular hobby was thoroughly and permanently extinguished by everything that happened during that single night. These days, whenever I happen to drive anywhere near that general part of town, even years removed from that terrifying chase, I still find myself instinctively taking a different route entirely. Unwilling to risk finding myself anywhere near that same stretch of road after dark, unwilling to ever again find out whether that same silent, headlight-less truck might still be waiting somewhere out there, ready to appear again out of nowhere the moment someone else's curiosity gets the better of them the same way ours once did. Every so often, usually late at night when I cannot quite fall asleep, my mind drifts back to that particular stretch of road, replaying the entire sequence of events one more time from start to finish. I picture the gravel piles rising up out of the darkness on either side of us, that small, incongruous school chair perched impossibly on top of one of them. And then, the sudden, cold shock of catching that flicker of movement in the rearview mirror, realizing in an instant that we were no longer alone on that empty road. I remember the specific sound of my friend's voice as she finally understood what I was screaming at her to do, the sudden lurch of the car as she floored the accelerator, and the sickening, helpless feeling of watching that massive dark shape refuse to fall behind no matter how fast we drove. I have told this story to a small handful of people over the years, always prefacing it the same way, acknowledging up front just how implausible and almost cinematic the whole thing sounds when spoken aloud. A silent, headlight-less truck chasing two panicked teenagers away from the property of one of Canada's most notorious serial killers sounds like something pulled directly from a horror movie script, rather than something that could have actually happened to two ordinary young women out for a pointless, thrill-seeking drive on an unremarkable weeknight. And yet it did happen, exactly the way I have described it here, every single detail of it seared permanently into my memory in a way that no amount of time or distance has ever managed to soften or fade. I do not know if I will ever get a real answer to what actually happened that night, who was driving that truck, or why they chose to chase us so aggressively and so silently through those otherwise empty, forgotten streets. Some mysteries, I have come to accept, simply do not resolve themselves no matter how many years pass or how many times you turn the details over in your own mind, searching for some thread of logic that finally makes sense of the whole experience. All I know for certain is what I felt in that moment, sitting frozen in the passenger seat, watching that truck's dark shape fill our rearview mirror, and the sheer, overwhelming relief of finally turning left while it disappeared to the right, gone as quickly and completely as it had first appeared behind us in the dark. This is a story that actually comes from my mother's own childhood, something she experienced firsthand many decades ago. My mother is in her late 50s now, and this particular experience happened to her when she was only about 14 years old, sometime around 1971 or 1972, down in Alabama. It took place during the fall season, sometime in October or November. Based on how she has always described the weather and the surrounding trees when she tells the story. She did not actually tell me any of this until I was already in college myself, and ever since she first shared it with me, it has genuinely creeped me out more than almost any other story I have ever heard, fictional or otherwise. My mother is the oldest of 5 children altogether. She has 3 younger sisters and 1 younger brother, who is the very youngest of the entire family. One particular weekend during the cooler part of that fall, my grandfather made the decision to take the whole family out together. My grandmother, my mother, and all of her siblings, 7 people total, out into a wooded area for some target practice with a rifle. My mother grew up in genuinely difficult financial circumstances, and the family did not always live in the safest neighborhoods. So my grandfather felt strongly that it was important for his children to learn how to properly handle and defend themselves with a firearm if that situation ever became necessary, because it was already deep into autumn by this point. The trees throughout the wooded area were completely bare of leaves, with thick piles of dead, fallen leaves scattered across the ground beneath them. The particular patch of woods they had chosen for this outing was situated just off a dirt road, out in a fairly rural, sparsely populated part of the county. Because the area was so far removed from any kind of regular traffic or civilization, my grandfather grew visibly startled at one point when he suddenly heard the distinct, deep roar of a car engine approaching from somewhere within the woods themselves. My mother has always remembered, with surprising clarity given how many years have passed, that the vehicle in question was a blue Ford Galaxy. Despite the fact that my grandfather was already holding a loaded rifle at that exact moment, the sudden realization that his wife and all 5 of his children were out there with him in a remote wooded area, completely unprotected should anything dangerous actually be approaching, caused him to panic immediately. He quickly instructed my grandmother and all of the children to hide themselves beneath a large pile of dead leaves scattered nearby, and he hid alongside them as well, all 7 of them crouched together, completely concealed beneath the leaves, waiting silently to see what exactly was approaching. From their hiding spot, they watched as the car came into view, and the man behind the wheel got out of the vehicle. He proceeded to drag the body of a woman out of the car, and without any hesitation or apparent concern, he simply dumped her there among the leaves in the woods before getting back into his car and driving away entirely. Once my grandfather felt reasonably certain that the man had fully left the area, he and the rest of the family emerged from their hiding place beneath the leaves. To everyone's genuine shock, the woman who had just been dumped there suddenly sat up entirely on her own, completely of her own accord, and looked directly at all of them, staring them straight in the face without any apparent injury or distress. My grandfather asked her immediately whether she needed any help. She told him no, that she would be fine on her own. She did not appear to be physically injured in any obvious way, and it was clear from her demeanor that she genuinely did not want any assistance from them. What struck my grandfather as particularly strange, looking back on it afterward, was that she had not put up any kind of struggle or resistance while the man was dragging her out of the car in the first place, suggesting to him that she must have known this man personally in some way, rather than being a complete stranger to him. Given everything that had just happened, my grandfather decided immediately to cut their target shooting outing short, rushing all of the children back toward their car in order to get everyone home safely as quickly as possible. He privately made plans, however, to return to that same spot later on his own, once the children were no longer with him, and it was safer to investigate further. As the family made their way back along the trail toward the dirt road where they had originally parked their own vehicle, they happened to pass directly by the same man, still driving that same blue Ford Galaxy, now moving slowly as he made his own way out of the wooded area. My mother happened to glance over into the car as they passed, and she noticed, lying right there on the front seat directly beside him, an enormous machete resting in plain view. My grandfather made absolutely certain, as they passed by this man, that his own rifle remained clearly visible, wanting to make sure the stranger understood that he was armed as well, though everyone in the family was extremely careful not to let on in any way that they had actually witnessed what had just happened back in the woods only minutes earlier. The man struck up a bit of casual small talk with my grandfather as they passed each other, asking how he was doing that day and what exactly the family had been out in the woods doing. My grandfather explained, keeping his voice as calm and ordinary sounding as he possibly could, that he had simply taken his family out for a bit of rifle practice. The man told him to have a nice day in response, and then continued on his way, driving further down the dirt road and out of sight. The following day, once the children were all safely at school and out of the way, my grandfather made the decision to return to that same spot in the woods on his own, wanting to investigate further now that it was safe to do so without endangering his family. When he arrived, there was no body anywhere to be found. However, scattered around the same general area where the woman had been dumped, he did discover several items left behind. A wig, apparently belonging to the woman, along with her purse, some used tissues, and a pair of eyeglasses. He carefully collected all of these items and brought them back home with him. According to what my grandfather later told the rest of the family, that specific stretch of woods had something of a local reputation for being a dumping ground for bodies over the years, along with rumors of shallow, hastily dug graves scattered throughout the area. A detail that made everything that had just happened feel even more disturbing and significant in hindsight. When he walked back into the house carrying all of these collected items, my mother reportedly became completely hysterical almost immediately, screaming repeatedly that he had killed that lady, that the man they had seen had killed that lady. Clearly deeply traumatized by everything she had witnessed the day before, and now forced to confront physical evidence of it all over again. My grandfather eventually took all of the items he had collected down to the local police station, reporting everything that had happened to the authorities. According to my mother, however, nothing significant ever seemed to come of that report. She never heard any further updates about the case, any news about the woman's identity, any arrest of the man in the blue Ford Galaxy, or any resolution to the situation whatsoever in all the years since. As far as she knows, it simply disappeared into silence after that initial police report was filed. There was one more unsettling detail connected to this entire experience that my mother did eventually mention as well. Early the following morning, before any of the children had left for school that day, my grandmother called home from her workplace to speak directly with my mother. My grandmother worked as a cashier and had to arrive at her job very early each morning, which meant that my mother, being the eldest child in the family, was typically responsible for getting all of her younger siblings ready and out the door for school on her own most mornings. My mother answered the phone that particular morning, and my grandmother told her, in a firm, urgent tone, that she should not take the school bus that day under any circumstances. Instead, my grandmother explained that she would personally come back home from work and drive all of the children to school herself that morning. Confused by this sudden change in their usual routine, my mother asked her mother directly why she needed to do this, why they could not simply take the bus the way they did every single other school day. My grandmother's response, delivered in a tone my mother has never forgotten in all the decades since, was simply, because that car is waiting for you at the bus stop. I have thought about this story countless times since my mother first told it to me, turning over every single detail in my mind, trying to understand exactly what must have really happened that day in the woods, who that woman actually was, what her relationship to the man in the blue Ford Galaxy might have been, and above everything else, how that same car ended up parked and waiting near my mother's own school bus stop the very next morning, apparently watching for the children specifically after everything that had already happened. My mother has never been able to offer any further explanation beyond what she has always told me, and my grandparents, who could have potentially provided more context or details over the years, have both since passed away, taking whatever additional knowledge they might have had about that entire situation along with them. All that remains now is my mother's own memory of that single terrifying weekend, preserved and passed down through her own retelling. A story that has genuinely unsettled me every single time I have thought about it since she first shared it with me during my college years. I do not know what ultimately happened to that woman, whether she survived whatever situation she had found herself trapped in with that man, or whether the dark rumors surrounding that particular stretch of woods regarding shallow graves and body dumping eventually claimed her as well. I do not know who that man truly was, what exactly his relationship was to the woman he so casually discarded among the leaves, or why. Of all the possible responses he could have had upon realizing a family had witnessed at least part of what had happened, he chose instead to engage in calm, ordinary small talk with my grandfather before driving away. And I especially do not know how he, or someone connected to him, managed to identify exactly which school bus stop my mother and her siblings used each morning, arriving there apparently within less than 24 hours of the entire incident occurring in those woods. What I do know is that my mother has carried this memory with her for well over 50 years now, and that even after all this time, even after decades of trying to make sense of what she witnessed as a frightened 14-year-old girl hiding beneath a pile of dead autumn leaves, she has never been able to find any kind of satisfying resolution or explanation for any of it. It remains, to this day, one of the single most unsettling stories I have ever heard, made even more disturbing by the fact that it did not happen to some distant stranger in some old, half-remembered legend, but to my own mother, in her own childhood, in those quiet, rural woods of Alabama, all those years ago. I have asked my mother, over the years since she first told me this story, whether she remembers any additional details beyond what she has always shared, hoping that maybe with enough time and reflection, some small, forgotten piece of the puzzle might surface that could help make sense of everything that happened during that strange weekend. She has told me that she remembers the woman's face with unsettling clarity, describing her as looking exhausted rather than frightened. Her expression oddly calm given the circumstances, as though whatever had happened to bring her out to that remote spot in the woods was simply an ordinary, expected part of her life, rather than something shocking or unusual to her personally. That particular detail has always stuck with me almost as much as the rest of the story, the unsettling idea that this woman may have been entirely accustomed to whatever dangerous, violent situation she found herself repeatedly caught up in with this man. My mother has also mentioned, on occasion, wondering whether the woman ultimately survived that entire encounter at all. Given the local reputation of that particular stretch of woods, the rumors of shallow graves and body dumping that my grandfather mentioned after his own investigation the following day, it is entirely possible that this woman, whoever she was, eventually did become one of the unfortunate victims those local rumors referred to. Her body perhaps ending up buried somewhere in that same general area at some later point, whether that same day or sometime afterward. There has never been any way for my family to confirm this one way or another. No news reports my mother ever recalls hearing. No missing persons cases she remembers being connected to the area during that particular time period. The detail about the car waiting at the school bus stop the very next morning has always been, for me personally, the single most chilling part of this entire story. It suggests, in a way that nothing else in the story quite manages to, a level of active, ongoing danger and surveillance that goes far beyond simply witnessing a single disturbing event out in the woods. Somehow, whoever was driving that vehicle had managed to identify precisely which children belonged to the family that had witnessed what happened, and precisely where and when those same children would be most vulnerable and accessible the very next day, standing exposed and unprotected at their regular school bus stop. I have wondered many times exactly how that identification could have happened so quickly within less than 24 hours of the entire incident in the woods taking place. Perhaps the man had somehow followed my grandfather's vehicle without any of them noticing, tracking them all the way back to their own home and then observing their morning routine from a distance. Perhaps he had some other means of gathering that information entirely, some connection within the small, close-knit rural community they lived in that allowed him to quickly identify exactly which family had witnessed what happened, and where those children could most easily be found the following morning. My mother has never been able to offer any concrete explanation for this particular detail, and it remains, even now, one of the most unsettling and unresolved elements of the entire story. I think in some ways this story has always stayed with me so vividly precisely because of how much of it remains permanently unresolved. There was no dramatic conclusion, no eventual arrest, no closure of any kind that my mother has ever been able to share with me. The police report my grandfather filed apparently went nowhere, at least as far as my mother ever learned, and the man in the blue Ford Galaxy simply vanished from their lives entirely after that single, terrifying encounter, leaving behind nothing but a handful of collected personal items, a persistent, decades-old memory, and a lingering, unanswerable question about exactly who that woman was and what ultimately happened to her. My mother is in her late 50s now, and she has lived an otherwise completely ordinary life since that single strange weekend back in 1971 or 1972. She raised her own family, worked steadily throughout her adult life, and has generally led the kind of unremarkable, stable existence that gives no outward indication of the genuinely disturbing experience she went through as a 14-year-old girl. But whenever this particular memory does come up, whether prompted by a conversation about strange childhood experiences or simply drifting unbidden into her own thoughts from time to time, she has told me that the same cold, unsettled feeling washes back over her instantly, as vivid and immediate as it must have felt on that original autumn day, hiding beneath a pile of dead leaves in the Alabama woods, watching a man calmly discard another human being before driving away as though nothing at all unusual had just occurred. This is a story that actually comes from my mother's own childhood, something she experienced firsthand many decades ago. My mother is in her late 50s now, and this particular experience happened to her when she was only about 14 years old, sometime around 1971 or 1972, down in Alabama. It took place during the fall season, sometime in October or November, based on how she has always described the weather and the surrounding trees when she tells the story. She did not actually tell me any of this until I was already in college myself, and ever since she first shared it with me, it has genuinely creeped me out more than almost any other story I have ever heard, fictional or otherwise. My mother is the oldest of 5 children altogether. She has 3 younger sisters and 1 younger brother, who is the very youngest of the entire family. One particular weekend during the cooler part of that fall, my grandfather made the decision to take the whole family out together. My grandmother, my mother, and all of her siblings, 7 people total, out into a wooded area for some target practice with a rifle. My mother grew up in genuinely difficult financial circumstances, and the family did not always live in the safest neighborhoods. So my grandfather felt strongly that it was important for his children to learn how to properly handle and defend themselves with a firearm if that situation ever became necessary. Because it was already deep into autumn by this point, the trees throughout the wooded area were completely bare of leaves, with thick piles of dead, fallen leaves scattered across the ground beneath them. The particular patch of woods they had chosen for this outing was situated just off a dirt road, out in a fairly rural, sparsely populated part of the county. Because the area was so far removed from any kind of regular traffic or civilization, my grandfather grew visibly startled at one point when he suddenly heard the distinct, deep roar of a car engine approaching from somewhere within the woods themselves. My mother has always remembered, with surprising clarity given how many years had passed, that the vehicle in question was a blue Ford Galaxy, despite the fact that my grandfather was already holding a loaded rifle at that exact moment. The sudden realization that his wife and all 5 of his children were out there with him in a remote wooded area, completely unprotected should anything dangerous actually be approaching, caused him to panic immediately. He quickly instructed my grandmother and all of the children to hide themselves beneath a large pile of dead leaves scattered nearby, and he hid alongside them as well, all 7 of them crouched together, completely concealed beneath the leaves, waiting silently to see what exactly was approaching. From their hiding spot, they watched as the car came into view, and the man behind the wheel got out of the vehicle. He proceeded to drag the body of a woman out of the car, and without any hesitation or apparent concern, he simply dumped her there among the leaves in the woods before getting back into his car and driving away entirely. Once my grandfather felt reasonably certain that the man had fully left the area, he and the rest of the family emerged from their hiding place beneath the leaves. To everyone's genuine shock, the woman who had just been dumped there suddenly sat up entirely on her own, completely of her own accord, and looked directly at all of them, staring them straight in the face without any apparent injury or distress. My grandfather asked her immediately whether she needed any help. She told him no, that she would be fine on her own. She did not appear to be physically injured in any obvious way, and it was clear from her demeanor that she genuinely did not want any assistance from them. What struck my grandfather as particularly strange, looking back on it afterward, was that she had not put up any kind of struggle or resistance while the man was dragging her out of the car in the first place, suggesting to him that she must have known this man personally in some way, rather than being a complete stranger to him. Given everything that had just happened, my grandfather decided immediately to cut their target shooting outing short, rushing all of the children back toward their car in order to get everyone home safely as quickly as possible. He privately made plans, however, to return to that same spot later on his own, once the children were no longer with him, and it was safer to investigate further. As the family made their way back along the trail toward the dirt road where they had originally parked their own vehicle, they happened to pass directly by the same man, still driving that same blue Ford Galaxy, now moving slowly as he made his own way out of the wooded area. My mother happened to glance over into the car as they passed, and she noticed, lying right there on the front seat directly beside him, an enormous machete resting in plain view. My grandfather made absolutely certain as they passed by this man that his own rifle remained clearly visible, wanting to make sure the stranger understood that he was armed as well, though everyone in the family was extremely careful not to let on in any way that they had actually witnessed what had just happened back in the woods only minutes earlier. The man struck up a bit of casual small talk with my grandfather as they passed each other, asking how he was doing that day and what exactly the family had been out in the woods doing. My grandfather explained, keeping his voice as calm and ordinary sounding as he possibly could, that he had simply taken his family out for a bit of rifle practice. The man told him to have a nice day in response, and then continued on his way, driving further down the dirt road and out of sight. The following day, once the children were all safely at school and out of the way, my grandfather made the decision to return to that same spot in the woods on his own, wanting to investigate further now that it was safe to do so without endangering his family. When he arrived, there was no body anywhere to be found. However, scattered around the same general area where the woman had been dumped, he did discover several items left behind. A wig, apparently belonging to the woman, along with her purse, some used tissues, and a pair of eyeglasses. He carefully collected all of these items and brought them back home with him. According to what my grandfather later told the rest of the family, that specific stretch of woods had something of a local reputation for being a dumping ground for bodies over the years, along with rumors of shallow, hastily dug graves scattered throughout the area, a detail that made everything that had just happened feel even more disturbing and significant in hindsight. When he walked back into the house carrying all of these collected items, my mother reportedly became completely hysterical almost immediately, screaming repeatedly that he had killed that lady, that the man they had seen had killed that lady. Clearly deeply traumatized by everything she had witnessed the day before, and now forced to confront physical evidence of it all over again. My grandfather eventually took all of the items he had collected down to the local police station, reporting everything that had happened to the authorities. According to my mother, however, nothing significant ever seemed to come of that report. She never heard any further updates about the case, any news about the woman's identity, any arrest of the man in the blue Ford Galaxy, or any resolution to the situation whatsoever in all the years since. As far as she knows, it simply disappeared into silence after that initial police report was filed. There was one more unsettling detail connected to this entire experience that my mother did eventually mention as well. Early the following morning, before any of the children had left for school that day, my grandmother called home from her workplace to speak directly with my mother. My grandmother worked as a cashier and had to arrive at her job very early each morning, which meant that my mother, being the eldest child in the family, was typically responsible for getting all of her younger siblings ready and out the door for school on her own most mornings. My mother answered the phone that particular morning, and my grandmother told her, in a firm, urgent tone, that she should not take the school bus that day, under any circumstances. Instead, my grandmother explained that she would personally come back home from work and drive all of the children to school herself that morning. Confused by this sudden change in their usual routine, my mother asked her mother directly why she needed to do this, why they could not simply take the bus the way they did every single other school day. My grandmother's response, delivered in a tone my mother has never forgotten in all the decades since, was simply, "Because that car is waiting for you at the bus stop." I have thought about this story countless times since my mother first told it to me, turning over every single detail in my mind, trying to understand exactly what must have really happened that day in the woods, who that woman actually was, what her relationship to the man in the blue Ford Galaxy might have been, and above everything else, how that same car ended up parked and waiting near my mother's own school bus stop the very next morning, apparently watching for the children specifically after everything that had already happened. My mother has never been able to offer any further explanation beyond what she has always told me, and my grandparents, who could have potentially provided more context or details over the years, have both since passed away, taking whatever additional knowledge they might have had about that entire situation along with them. All that remains now is my mother's own memory of that single, terrifying weekend, preserved and passed down through her own retelling. A story that has genuinely unsettled me every single time I have thought about it since she first shared it with me during my college years. I do not know what ultimately happened to that woman, whether she survived whatever situation she had found herself trapped in with that man, or whether the dark rumors surrounding that particular stretch of woods regarding shallow graves and body dumping eventually claimed her as well. I do not know who that man truly was, what exactly his relationship was to the woman he so casually discarded among the leaves, or why. Of all the possible responses he could have had upon realizing a family had witnessed at least part of what had happened, he chose instead to engage in calm, ordinary small talk with my grandfather before driving away. And I especially do not know how he, or someone connected to him, managed to identify exactly which school bus stop my mother and her siblings used each morning, arriving there apparently within less than 24 hours of the entire incident occurring in those woods. What I do know is that my mother has carried this memory with her for well over 50 years now, and that even after all this time, even after decades of trying to make sense of what she witnessed as a frightened 14-year-old girl hiding beneath a pile of dead autumn leaves. She has never been able to find any kind of satisfying resolution or explanation for any of it. It remains, to this day, one of the single most unsettling stories I have ever heard, made even more disturbing by the fact that it did not happen to some distant stranger in some old, half-remembered legend, but to my own mother, in her own childhood, in those quiet, rural woods of Alabama, all those years ago. I have asked my mother, over the years since she first told me this story, whether she remembers any additional details beyond what she has always shared, hoping that maybe with enough time and reflection, some small forgotten piece of the puzzle might surface that could help make sense of everything that happened during that strange weekend. She has told me that she remembers the woman's face with unsettling clarity, describing her as looking exhausted rather than frightened. Her expression oddly calm given the circumstances, as though whatever had happened to bring her out to that remote spot in the woods was simply an ordinary, expected part of her life, rather than something shocking or unusual to her personally. That particular detail has always stuck with me almost as much as the rest of the story. The unsettling idea that this woman may have been entirely accustomed to whatever dangerous, violent situation she found herself repeatedly caught up in with this man. My mother has also mentioned, on occasion, wondering whether the woman ultimately survived that entire encounter at all. Given the local reputation of that particular stretch of woods, the rumors of shallow graves and body dumping that my grandfather mentioned after his own investigation the following day, it is entirely possible that this woman, whoever she was, eventually did become one of the unfortunate victims those local rumors referred to. Her body perhaps ending up buried somewhere in that same general area at some later point, whether that same day or sometime afterward. There has never been any way for my family to confirm this, one way or another. No news reports my mother ever recalls hearing. No missing persons cases she remembers being connected to the area during that particular time period. The detail about the car waiting at the school bus stop the very next morning has always been, for me, personally, the single most chilling part of this entire story. It suggests, in a way that nothing else in the story quite manages to, a level of active, ongoing danger and surveillance that goes far beyond simply witnessing a single disturbing event out in the woods. Somehow, whoever was driving that vehicle had managed to identify precisely which children belonged to the family that had witnessed what happened, and precisely where and when those same children would be most vulnerable and accessible the very next day, standing exposed and unprotected at their regular school bus stop. I have wondered many times exactly how that identification could have happened so quickly, within less than 24 hours of the entire incident in the woods taking place. Perhaps the man had somehow followed my grandfather's vehicle without any of them noticing, tracking them all the way back to their own home and then observing their morning routine from a distance. Perhaps he had some other means of gathering that information entirely, some connection within the small, close-knit rural community they lived in that allowed him to quickly identify exactly which family had witnessed what happened and where those children could most easily be found the following morning. My mother has never been able to offer any concrete explanation for this particular detail, and it remains, even now, one of the most unsettling and unresolved elements of the entire story. I think in some ways this story has always stayed with me so vividly precisely because of how much of it remains permanently unresolved. There was no dramatic conclusion, no eventual arrest, no closure of any kind that my mother has ever been able to share with me. The police report my grandfather filed apparently went nowhere, at least as far as my mother ever learned, and the man in the blue Ford Galaxy simply vanished from their lives entirely after that single, terrifying encounter. leaving behind nothing but a handful of collected personal items, a persistent, decades-old memory, and a lingering, unanswerable question about exactly who that woman was and what ultimately happened to her. My mother is in her late 50s now, and she has lived an otherwise completely ordinary life since that single strange weekend back in 1971 or 1972. She raised her own family, worked steadily throughout her adult life, and has generally led the kind of unremarkable, stable existence that gives no outward indication of the genuinely disturbing experience she went through as a 14-year-old girl. But whenever this particular memory does come up, whether prompted by a conversation about strange childhood experiences or simply drifting unbidden into her own thoughts from time to time, she has told me that the same cold, unsettled feeling washes back over her instantly, as vivid and immediate as it must have felt on that original autumn day, hiding beneath a pile of dead leaves in the Alabama woods, watching a man calmly discard another human being before driving away as though nothing at all unusual had just occurred. Whenever I think about this story now myself, having heard it directly from my own mother rather than reading it as some anonymous tale online, I find myself struck most by how ordinary everything leading up to that moment must have felt. A family outing, a father teaching his children basic gun safety and marksmanship, a quiet weekend spent together in the woods during a pleasant, cool autumn afternoon. There was nothing in the setup of that day that would have suggested anything was about to go so horribly wrong, nothing that would have warned any of them what they were about to witness. It is that ordinary, unremarkable beginning that has always made the rest of the story feel so much more unsettling to me. A stark reminder of how quickly and completely an entirely mundane family activity can suddenly intersect with something genuinely dark and dangerous, without any warning at all. The experiences I have to share are more on the spooky side rather than genuinely terrifying, but they have both stuck with me over the years, regardless. Small, quietly unsettling moments that I still think about from time to time, even now. The first one happened back when I was still in middle school. My friends and I were gathered together one evening in someone's basement, celebrating a birthday for one of the people in our friend group. The kind of casual, low-key gathering that middle schoolers often have. A handful of us hanging out together, chatting, eating snacks, and generally enjoying each other's company on an otherwise ordinary evening. At some point during the party, one of my friends received a text message from a completely unknown phone number, one that none of us recognized at all. I honestly do not remember the exact wording of the message anymore, given how many years have passed since then, but the general gist of it was something along the lines of the sender claiming they could actually see us at that very moment, and adding some comment about thinking we looked pretty. Naturally, this got all of our attention immediately, and I remember speaking up and suggesting that whoever was sending this message was probably just trying to scare us. Some random person attempting to spook a group of middle school girls at a birthday party purely for their own amusement. I suggested that we respond by asking them to actually prove that they could see us, thinking that whoever was behind this would obviously have no real way of doing so, and that this would quickly expose the whole thing as an empty, baseless prank. We spent a few minutes brainstorming exactly what kind of question we could ask that would genuinely prove whether this person could actually see us or not. One of my friends suggested asking what color her hair was, but we quickly realized this would not really prove anything meaningful, since our entire friend group at the time consisted of girls with either blonde or brunette hair, nothing distinctive or unusual enough about any of our hair colors specifically that would count as solid proof either way. I suggested a different question instead, one I thought might actually work better as a genuine test. I had been wearing a particular hat that entire evening, one I had been jokingly referring to all night as my gangster hat, a completely ridiculous nickname that admittedly made a lot more sense in the context of middle school humor than it probably does looking back on it now as an adult. I suggested we ask whoever was texting us what I had been calling my hat all night, reasoning that this was such a specific, obscure detail that there was no possible way an outside prankster could know the answer unless they genuinely had some way of actually observing us directly. In the end, we decided not to send either of these particular questions, choosing instead not to respond to the unknown number at all for the time being, still trying to decide collectively how exactly we wanted to handle the whole situation. But then, without any prompting from us whatsoever, we received another message back from that same unknown number. This new message stated plainly that my friend's hair was brown, and that the hat I had on was in fact my gangster hat, referring to it by the exact same specific, ridiculous nickname I had been using all evening among my own friends. I remember the immediate chilling wave of fear that went through the entire group the moment we read that message. Whoever was sending these texts had somehow correctly answered both of the very specific questions we had only discussed among ourselves, out loud, in that basement. Questions we had ultimately decided not to actually send to them at all. There was no way, as far as any of us could figure out in that moment, that this person could have known those particular answers unless they genuinely did have some way of observing us directly, whether through some kind of hidden camera or by physically watching us from somewhere close by that we simply had not noticed. Throughout the rest of that evening, we continued receiving text messages from that same unknown number, various comments about how pretty we supposedly looked, and occasional remarks referencing specific things we were doing at any given moment during the party. It genuinely unsettled me deeply at the time, that persistent sense that someone somewhere was actively watching everything we did and said throughout that entire evening, close enough to catch details we ourselves had only just spoken about privately among our small group. We all tried to reassure each other, suggesting that it was probably nothing more sinister than some immature classmate from school, someone who knew us well enough to correctly guess certain details about us, or who perhaps had some other way of gathering information about our conversation that we simply were not considering in the moment. We told ourselves repeatedly that we should probably just calm down and not let it ruin the rest of the birthday celebration. But even after convincing myself, at least on some rational level, that it was likely nothing more than an elaborate, if impressively executed, prank by someone who knew us, I have never been able to fully shake the specific visceral discomfort of that particular feeling. The distinct sense of being watched, of someone somewhere having access to details about us that should have been entirely private and unknowable to any outside observer. Even now, years removed from that particular birthday party, I still do not like that specific feeling, whenever it arises in any context, of sensing that I am being observed by someone I cannot see or identify. The second experience I want to share happened much more recently, only about a month or so ago at this point. I had fallen asleep on the couch one evening, and during that sleep, I had an unusually vivid, disturbing nightmare involving a man who was going around killing people using a bow and arrow. Within the dream itself, this behavior had apparently become something of a widespread, alarming trend with people in various locations attacking others using bows and arrows, seemingly because these particular weapons were easy enough for almost anyone to construct or obtain on their own. I distinctly remember one particularly vivid image from within that dream, a person being shot with an arrow at what appeared to be some kind of small outdoor shopping strip or shopping center. The specific layout and appearance of that location standing out with unusual clarity compared to the rest of the otherwise fairly generic, blurry dream imagery surrounding it. The entire dream had genuinely terrified me while I was still asleep, my mind fully immersed in the fear and danger of that imagined scenario. But once I actually woke up afterward, I quickly recognized just how ridiculous and unrealistic the entire premise of the dream truly was. A widespread epidemic of ordinary people attacking each other with homemade bows and arrows, purely because they happened to be easy to construct, feeling like exactly the kind of absurd, illogical scenario that dreams often produce without any real basis in genuine, waking reality. Later that same day, after having largely forgotten about the specific details of the dream by that point, I happened to open up Reddit, browsing through the front page the way I often do during any spare moment throughout my day. Right there on the front page, I came across a post from someone describing how an item had been stolen out of their garage recently. Curious, I clicked on the accompanying picture included in that post and found myself looking at an image of a bow and arrow, apparently the exact item that had been stolen from this person's garage. I remember feeling a small, immediate jolt of surprise at this coincidence, given how specifically my earlier nightmare had revolved around exactly that same weapon, a bow and arrow, being used by someone to attack other people. It felt like an odd, slightly unsettling overlap between my dream and something happening in real, waking life, even though logically, bows and arrows are common enough items that this kind of coincidental overlap should not have been especially surprising or significant on its own. But what struck me as considerably stranger, once I actually looked further into the details of that particular Reddit post, was discovering the specific location where this theft had apparently taken place. Curious, I looked up that exact address and found myself looking at images of a small shopping center, one that bore an unmistakable, striking resemblance to the exact same shopping strip I had seen so vividly within my own dream from earlier that day. The same one where, within the dream itself, someone had been shot with an arrow. To be entirely clear, nothing remotely violent has actually happened at that particular shopping center in real life. No reports of anyone being attacked or shot with a bow and arrow. Nothing beyond the original, fairly mundane report of an item simply being stolen out of someone's garage nearby. But the specific overlap between my own dream imagery from earlier that day and then discovering, purely by chance, later that same afternoon, both a bow and arrow theft and a matching shopping center location, has always struck me as a genuinely strange, unsettling little coincidence, one I have never been able to fully explain or entirely shake from my mind since it happened. I do not consider myself someone who believes strongly in prophetic dreams, or any kind of genuine psychic ability to predict future events through sleep, and I recognize fully that both of these particular experiences likely have entirely mundane, rational explanations behind them if I dug deeply enough. The unknown number texting my friends and me at that middle school birthday party was almost certainly just some classmate with access to more information about us than we initially realized, whether through some kind of hidden observation, a shared friend feeding them information in real time, or some other similarly ordinary explanation we simply never managed to fully uncover at the time. And the overlap between my dream and that Reddit post regarding the bow and arrow theft is very likely nothing more than an unremarkable coincidence, my own subconscious perhaps having been influenced by some unrelated, half-remembered piece of media or news story about bow and arrow related crime that I had encountered at some earlier point without fully registering it consciously. But even with those reasonable, rational explanations readily available to me, both of these experiences have remained genuinely unsettling in their own smaller, quieter way. precisely because of how specifically and precisely certain small details lined up with things that felt like they should have been entirely private or entirely random, respectively. The middle school incident, in particular, has always stuck with me because of that specific, lingering discomfort surrounding the idea of being actively watched by someone I could not see or identify, a feeling I have simply never enjoyed experiencing in any context, no matter how mundane the actual explanation likely was behind it. And the dream involving the bow and arrow. However unlikely it is that any genuine prophetic or psychic element was truly involved, has still left me with a small, persistent sense of unease whenever I happen to think back on it. Remembering that particular shopping center appearing so vividly within my own imagination hours before I ever encountered any real-world reference to it whatsoever. Thinking back on the middle school story now, as an adult with a bit more perspective and life experience than I had at the time, I find myself considering all the various ways that unknown number could have plausibly known those specific details about us. It occurs to me now that perhaps one of the other girls at the party, someone within our own friend group, might have quietly been in contact with whoever was sending those texts, feeding them real-time updates about our conversation without any of the rest of us realizing it. Middle school friendships and social dynamics can be complicated in ways that are not always obvious in the moment, and it is entirely possible that one of the people sitting right there with us in that basement was secretly orchestrating the whole thing as an elaborate prank, using her own phone to text a friend outside the room, or even using a second phone of her own to send those messages while pretending to be just as confused and frightened as the rest of us. I have actually brought this theory up with some of the same friends who were there that night, on the rare occasions the story has resurfaced during conversations about strange or spooky personal experiences. None of us has ever been able to identify with any real confidence who might have been behind it, and everyone who was present that evening has always maintained that they had nothing to do with sending those messages themselves. Whether that is genuinely true, or whether whoever was actually responsible has simply chosen never to admit it, even all these years later, I suppose I will never fully know for certain. What has always struck me as slightly odd, thinking back on it now, is the specific tone of those messages throughout the rest of that evening, repeatedly commenting on how pretty we all looked, along with occasional remarks about whatever we happened to be doing at any given moment. It felt less like the kind of prank a mischievous classmate might orchestrate purely for a laugh, and more like something with a slightly different, harder to define undertone to it. Something that felt a bit more deliberate and sustained than a single one-off joke text message would typically feel. I do not mean to suggest anything more sinister necessarily happened as a result of it, since nothing further ever came of the whole situation beyond that single strange evening, but the specific persistence and tone of those messages has always lingered with me as one of the stranger, harder to fully explain details of the entire experience. As for the bow and arrow dream, I have thought about it periodically in the weeks since it happened, occasionally checking back on that same Reddit thread out of simple curiosity to see whether any further updates had been posted regarding the stolen item or the shopping center in question. As far as I am aware, nothing further ever developed from that particular post. No arrests, no additional incidents, nothing beyond the original, fairly ordinary report of a theft having occurred. The shopping center itself has remained, as far as I know, a completely ordinary, unremarkable location, with no history of violence or anything resembling the fictional scenario my own dream had constructed around it. I suppose, in the end, both of these stories share a similar underlying quality that has kept them lodged so persistently in my memory over the years. That particular unsettling sensation of something ordinary suddenly intersecting, however briefly and however explainably, with something that felt like it should not have been possible. whether that meant a stranger somehow knowing private details from a conversation they should have had no way of overhearing, or a dream image lining up, purely by coincidence, with a real-world news post encountered only hours later. Neither experience ever escalated into anything more seriously frightening or dangerous, and both, I suspect, likely have entirely mundane explanations if examined closely enough. But the small, lingering unease each one left behind has never fully faded, even now, years after the middle school incident. And even now, only a month or so removed from that strange, oddly specific dream about a shopping center I had apparently pictured with far more accuracy than I ever consciously realized at the time. I think what ties both experiences together most, at least for me personally, is this small, nagging feeling that our minds, and the world around us, occasionally line up in ways that defy easy explanation, without ever quite crossing over into something we could call truly, undeniably supernatural. Nothing about either story would hold up as concrete proof of anything paranormal if I tried to present it that way. And yet both experiences left me with that same quiet, persistent chill, the sense that maybe, every so often, the ordinary world brushes up against something slightly stranger than we usually give it credit for, close enough to notice, but never quite close enough to fully understand. I do not know if I will ever have another experience quite like either of these two, and in some ways, I am perfectly content with that. Both stories remain small, contained little mysteries within my own personal history. The kind of thing I bring up occasionally when friends are trading their own spooky stories late at night, always prefacing them the same way, admitting that neither one is particularly terrifying compared to some of the more dramatic tales other people tend to share. But for me, they have always carried their own particular weight, small reminders that the world does not always explain itself as neatly and completely as we might like it to, and that sometimes the smallest, quietest coincidences are the ones that end up staying with you the longest, long after the louder, more dramatic stories have faded from memory entirely, quietly reminding me every so often that the ordinary world I move through every day is perhaps not always quite as fully explainable and predictable as I generally like to assume it is, and that every now and then something small and strange slips through the cracks of that assumption, just enough to leave a lasting impression behind.